like you all know. And I guess I'll say that I'm a practicing poet, seeing that I've done it for quite a while and done all sorts of things with it. I've been writing poetry since maybe the age of 12. Um, my elder brother was a poet, or is a poet, and I started writing poetry by copying his poems into my own exercise book. Till one day he told me that's actually not how to write poetry, that you have to come up with this stuff by yourself. And then I began to write. And I've been keeping everything I wrote since the age of 12. So I have piles and piles of poetry. And I've gone through all sorts of phases as a poet, the kinds of things I write, how I write, the different styles. So I've tried all kinds of things. And I enjoy it. I write poetry primarily because it helps me I started my primary motivation in getting into poetry was that it helped me get stuff off my chest. I've always been a very quiet, introverted sort of person. And I have 3 elder ones, and sort of they came sort of a year after each other, and then there was this 3-year gap, and then I came. So I was a bit too young to be in their clique, if you know what I mean. So many times when they're talking, or I can't really chip in or join the conversation because I was too young, but I had stuff, that I wanted to say. So poetry became an outlet for me to just say things that nobody was interested in hearing a 12-year-old or 13-year-old saying. So poetry was first and foremost an outlet for me, for my emotions, my thoughts. And seeing that I found it so early, it helped me to deal with the pressures of growing up, whether it's having a tough day in school, whether it's girls, a broken heart, being uncomfortable with your body, peer pressure, just all those things that you struggle with transiting from child to adult, those twisted years of being a teenager. Poetry helped me cope, so every time I read my poetry collections and going into the past, it's almost like a journal. When I was going through this, I will write this poem to deal with it. If somebody I love dies, I'll write a poem. If I'm loving someone and they're not loving me back, I'll write a poem. If, I'm struggling in school, I'll write a poem. If I think people don't like me and I don't understand it, I'll write a poem. So that was what poetry was for me, like a crutch, and it served me all my life. Like I said, I've gone through many phases and seasons as a poet. It doesn't serve so much as a crutch these days for me. It's transited to something else, but that was how I came to it, and so I never once thought it was something people did. I didn't think it, something people did as a career or a profession, or you did it to make money, or, I just thought it was something, it was like breathing out. It was just something I needed to do to cope with life. I didn't have any training. Never had any formal training in writing poetry. Never gone for a creative writing workshop like this one, which is why oftentimes when people ask me to host a workshop, I'm just like, because I never went for a workshop. Didn't study. I studied literature in secondary school, like most of the people did, but that was about it. So all the training I had came from practice, from reading. I've always read a lot, reading other people's poems, poets that I admired. Luckily, my brother was there and his friend was a very good poet as well. just reading and reading and writing and writing and writing and writing. That was how I developed. Lots of reading, lots of writing. So it's a very organic way, but it takes a longer time, but eventually you get there. So that was how it sort of what motivated me to begin to write poetry and how I came at it. Okay, so if we take that as some sort of template as to what an introduction should be, can I then ask Augusta? You're the first in, so let's have your intro, knowing that you also may have to leave soon. Augusta. Yeah. So essentially, what's the motivation? What's the motivation with poetry, to write poetry if you do, or to learn about it? And if you write poetry, what kind of poetry do you write?
Okay, for me, I have the same experience with you. I have a lot of older siblings that are way older than me. Like the last one is 5 years older than me, and they're all boys. So I'm the only girl. And growing up, I didn't have anybody to talk to. They'll say, "You talk too much. You play too much." You know, I'm extrovert. I'm not introvert. And everybody say, "Calm down. Shut up. Do this." So I had to find a way to channel all my energy, all the things I want to say somewhere. And I also did literature in school. So I started writing from secondary school. I used to have a book of poems, stories, short stories and stuff. But when I got into medical school, it's as if like somebody just pressed the button and everything just went on hold. So I've been trying to reactivate this by gifts so that it doesn't dissipate and end totally. That's why I'm always trying to come for these workshops, and that's why I joined ALS in the first place.
Okay, so I assume that you also write the kind of poetry I started out writing, just fleeting
just
thoughts.
expressive poetry. When I'm in the height of emotion, when I'm very happy or when I'm very sad. But I can't just, like right now, it's difficult for me to just sit down and put thoughts together without having those extreme emotions.
Okay. I get you. I understand where you're coming from perfectly. Thank you, Doc. Okay, let me take Aisha. If you want to maybe talk a bit about your own experience, why you write poetry, how you came to it, and so the sorts of poetry that you write.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
So I actually started writing poetry. The first one I wrote was actually after a guy I liked rejected me. So basically, I write poetry to sort of explain stuff that happened to me. So immediately after that, that was before I got admission into school. So I just wrote that poem, and then I didn't really even think it was a poem because I wrote it in verses, but I didn't really use a lot of metaphors. So after that, I didn't write a poem again until I joined a creative writing club in my school, ABU. That was when I actually started writing poetry, to just writing poetry because I wanted to write poetry, not because I wanted to deal with emotions. And then because I liked, anytime I would come for the meetings, I would see people read poetry, and I was like, well, I can do this. I've done this before, I think. And that's how I started writing poetry. But for me, it's always been this way to explain things that are happening around me, because I'm this type of person that doesn't express feelings very well.
To explain to who, yourself or to people?
Yes. So, and I find it hard.
Sorry, did you get my question?
How I feel.
Yeah. When the explanation, is it, when you say to explain what's happening around you, is the explanation for you or is it for others?
Yes. Yeah, to me, because most of the time I end up, I used to have this issue of gaslighting my own feelings and sort of ignoring it. So every time I write a poem down, it's like, okay, this is actually how I'm feeling. And I kind of everything makes sense when I write it down.
Yeah.
And then I understand it properly when I write it down.
Yeah. Makes perfect sense. Thank you for sharing.
What?
I said it makes perfect sense. And thank you for sharing. We all became nothing. There's nothing that has made more poets in this world than a broken heart. That is the largest factory of poets. So it's very normal. Umi, can we hear sort of, do you want to talk a bit about how you came to poetry and what sorts of poetry you write? Are you there?
Yeah, hello. So basically I started writing poetry 4 years ago, and it was sort of a way for me to heal because I was depressed. So it was like a safe space for me, and like I'm scared of vulnerability. So I'm the type of person that doesn't really know how to talk about what I'm feeling.
Yeah.
So it was like a way for me to like just vent at that time. And as you know, as I started growing, it was like, okay, writing about things around me, you know, things that I've noticed and I cannot really voice out because, you know, people might think, oh, it's none of her business, so why is she talking about it? So instead, I just write it down and yeah.
So it's like all the poets on this workshop have the same profile. Introverted, emotionally vulnerable, have lots of things to say, but you know, sometimes you just don't have either you feel people, you just don't have the courage to just stand up and say it. So you're right. Very, 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 very normal. That's how we all came to poetry. And I'm interested in it because poetry, as we will see, poetry is an art that welcomes all comers. You know, it is not like writing a novel or writing a song or writing a play. Poetry literally welcomes everybody because poetry can be anything. And but we'll get into all that. Two more people just joined us. Odafe, and Vera. So Odafe, what we're doing now is we're just introducing ourselves and sort of speaking to the issue of why we write poetry, why we came to write poetry, you know, how we're introduced to it, why we took to it, what it does for us, and then what kinds of poetry we write. So Odafe, if you can hear me, I don't know if you want to do that as well. Hello, Odafe. What about Vera? Vera, can you hear me? Hello? No response. All right, let's assume that maybe there's some technical issues on their side, and eventually we shall hear their voices and see their faces. So I'll write on, I'll continue. Please relax. This is not some formal meeting. We're talking about poetry. It's art. It's very close to the heart. It's very personal, you know, so it's informal. If there are things you want to ask me, specific things you want to ask me, and I haven't covered it or haven't talked about it.
The next 6 to 7 months, you have not taken to worry, complain about you can't on your health.
So if there are specific things that you want to ask me, talk about, address, feel free to bring them up as and when you please. Whenever you can, please show us your face so that it's a personable meeting. So one is not just staring at a screen. So I can see who I'm talking to, as it would have been if we're all in the same room, but for COVID. I'm going to share my screen. I have a little PowerPoint slide prepared. I may be going back and forth between that slide and the screen. So I'm just going to share it, and you let me know if you can. Why is it now that I want to share that I can't find it? Okay. Just give me a second. Let me pull up the PowerPoint. Everybody's searching for me wrong. There we go.
Yes, showing myself.
I'm working. Okay, allow me to work. I'm gonna play outside. Can everybody see the PowerPoint? ALITFEST 2020 Poetry Workshop. Can we all see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Is that Vera? Okay, Vera, we're still struggling to hear you. But can you hear me? If you can hear me, just wave. No. Odafe, can you hear me? If you can hear me, wave.
Caxton and Remy. So I don't think Adebayo is.
Okay. Vera, can you hear me? Debbie. Hello. Debbie, can you hear me? Augusta, can you see the screen I'm sharing? Can you see the PowerPoint?
I see a little bit distracted in the office.
No, but
I can see the screen.
Okay, cool. Umi, can you see it?
Yes, I can.
Okay, no trouble.
It says ALITFEST 2020 Poetry Workshop hosted by Dike Chukwumerije.
Okay, good. All right, so let's start. Odafe. I don't think these other ones are able to hear. Okay, what about Essay? Essay, you're here. Can you hear me? You can hear me. Good morning. Okay, cool. Okay, so moving on. Essentially, we're going to be talking about these things. Defining poetry, really understanding what it is and what it does. It's a very tricky subject. It doesn't have any structure, it doesn't have any. So it's very important to, as a poet, to really understand your art. What is it and what can you do with it? It's also important to understand yourself, because poetry is a very vast landscape and you need to know where you fit in, where you can maximize your own natural gifts as a poet. So you need to know all the options available. So I'm going to try and lay out a landscape. I'm just going to try and put out everything to help you as a poet locate yourself, sort of find where you belong or your niche and understand how you can progress. Who is this one now? Okay, thank you. So that's what we're going to be doing. This is not a typical workshop. I'm not just going to be talking about simile and metaphor and metonymy and all those things, figures of speech. I'm going to be really trying to maybe shake a bit how you see poetry in general and how you understand it, and also try and talk a bit about some fundamental principles about the art. So we'll get to some of the practical things. I read all the entries you sent in. In fact, I was just working on some of them this morning, putting notes and comments and things like that. I wasn't able to get through all of them, but hopefully at some point we'll also be able to look at individual works that were sent in and just see where they could have been made better and why they were weak in certain places. Understanding why is more important than me just saying there's something wrong with that line. I'm trying to get you to the point where you understand why. Okay, so we're going to start with defining poetry. Now, poetry has no definition as number one. You can only describe it, what it does, how it works, what it looks like, how it can be constructed. It has no definition, but anybody you ask will define it for you. One person, Emily Dixon, says, in definition of poetry, she says, it is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. If I read a book and it makes my body so cold, no fire could ever warm me, I know that it is poetry. Okay, that's what she says. Another guy that was asked to define it, Dylan Thomas, says, poetry is whatever makes me laugh or cry or yawn, what makes my toenails twinkle, what makes me want to do this or that or nothing. Okay. Then they called another man, Mark Flanagan. They said, define poetry. He said, poetry is the chiseled marble of language. It is a paint-spattered canvas, but the poet uses words instead of paint, and that canvas is you. So you can see for yourself why it is better to describe rather than define poetry. Because all of us have our definitions that really don't make sense. In a way, I mean, it makes sense, but you know. Now, the easiest way to describe poetry is to say that it is not prose. Poetry is not prose. Prose uses the normal structure of language, the normal flow of language, and the normal meaning of language. Poetry does the opposite. Traditionally, poetry Now, traditionally, poetry is defined by the three striking ways in which it diverges from prose. So traditionally, poetry is described by the three ways in which it does not resemble prose. Number one, in the unusual ways in which it constructs language. The unusual ways in which it constructs language. Number two, the unnatural flow it follows when using language. All right, number one, the unusual way in which it constructs language. Number two, the unnatural flow it follows when it uses language. And number three, the abnormal meanings it attaches to language. These are the three distinguishing features of poetry. The unusual way in which it constructs language, the unnatural flow it follows when using language, and number three, the abnormal meanings it attaches to language. Okay? Please, if at any time you can't hear me, this is all over the internet, so I can't see who is listening and who is hearing and who is not. So if you're having problems hearing, please let us know, okay? Because these things are very important. This foundation I'm laying for the things we're going to be doing at the end when we start looking at your pieces. So when I tell you that this is what I think about this line, you will understand why I am saying it and where I am coming from. Because that's what I would like you to leave with today. I would like you to add to whatever arsenal you already have, the way I see things, okay? So the three distinguishing features of poetry. One, the unusual way in which it constructs language, the unnatural flow it follows when using language, and three, the abnormal meanings it attaches to language. Now let us look at these three characteristics a bit closer. Number one, the unusual way in which poetry constructs language. Every piece of writing is constructed from primary building blocks, okay? Every piece of writing is constructed from a primary building block. In prose, that primary building block is, of course, the sentence. The sentence. The sentence is the normal primary building block of writing. What is a sentence? A sentence is a complete thought. It has a subject, it has a verb, and it has an object. It can stand alone. It paints a complete picture. You cannot start a sentence and not complete it. A sentence is as long as it needs to be to complete the thought it is expressing. Like this, sentences come together to form a paragraph. Paragraphs come together to form a chapter. Chapters come together to form a book. This is how prose is constructed. The primary building block is the sentence. In poetry, the primary building block is not a sentence. In poetry, the primary building block is the fragment of a sentence. It could be a phrase or a dependent clause. In poetry, the primary building block is an incomplete sentence. That is a sentence that does not contain a complete thought. This is very important, okay? Now the difference between using a sentence to build a narrative and using a phrase or a dependent clause or a fragment of a sentence to build a narrative is the difference between, for instance, showing somebody the picture of a cat on one hand, and on the other hand, just showing them a blank piece of paper with the word meow written on it. That's the difference between building with a sentence and building with the fragment of a sentence. In one, you show somebody the picture of a complete cat. In the other one, you show them a blank picture that just had the word meow written on it. Okay? So the primary building block in poetry is what is a hint, a glimpse of a whole. Poetry will give you a glimpse, a part of a whole, and would expect that from that part, you would guess what the whole is. It gives you a hint, a glimpse, a fragment, a piece. And that is why poetry is so good at expressing feelings and emotions and confusions and questions and asking and probings, for these are all fragments of thoughts, yearning for completion. Your feelings are not complete thoughts. They're not whole pictures. They are flashes, fragments, pieces. And because the primary building block in poetry is the incomplete thought, it is excellent for capturing fragments of thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Okay? So it is these fragments of sentences that stack up to form a line in poetry. And it is that line that stacks up to form a verse. And it is that verse, those verses that stack up to form a poem. This is how poetry is constructed, using incomplete thoughts, using phrases and dependent clauses. Poetry does not need one complete sentence. I'll give you an example. Okay. How many people here have read the poem If by Rudyard Kipling? How many people here know that poem? Do you know the poem If by Rudyard Kipling? Omi, do you know that poem? No, okay. I'm going to Google it and then share my screen just so that you can have the poem in front of you and I can show you what I mean. So I'm just Googling it now. Found it online. Let's try and share this screen. Hassan knows the poem, good. Okay, I'm sharing it now. Everybody should be seeing it. This is a poem by a poet known as Rudyard Kipling. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Rudyard Kipling. Anyway, it's called If. It's a, and we'll come to these kinds of poems. It's a motivational type of poem. It says, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. If you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. If you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies, or being hated, don't give way to hating, and yet you don't look too good nor talk too wise. If you can dream and not make your dreams your master, if you can think and not make your thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same, if you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to broken and stoop and build them up with worn-out tools, if you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss and lose and start again at your beginnings and never breathe a word about your loss, if you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiven minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and which is more, you'll be a man, my son. Now that is a poem that is almost entirely made up of clauses. 98% of that poem, there is not one complete sentence in it. If you can blah, 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 if you can, whenever if blah, blah, blah is what's called a dependent clause, that means you started a thought, but you didn't complete it. So that poem is a sequence of incomplete thoughts that are only completed with the last two lines right at the end of the poem. So at the beginning, he says, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, at the end, he says, yours is the earth and everything that's in it. That's the completion. If you can do this, then yours is the earth. If you can do this, then yours is the earth. But instead, he writes down all the conditional clauses first, all the dependent clauses first, and then decides to close it at the end with the end of all the clauses. You can't write prose like this. You can't write this as prose. This is in fact one long sentence. This entire poem is one sentence. And that is the abnormal way that poetry constructs language. It chops it up in a way that prose cannot. All right? So it's important to remember this, that poetry does not need to have a complete sentence in it. The building block of poetry is the fragment of the sentence, the incomplete thought, the phrase, the dependent clause. Now, this does not mean that poetry cannot use sentences to build. It just means that it does not have to. It means that even when you do not have a complete thought, even when you don't have a full grasp of what you are talking about, you can still write brilliant poetry on it. Simply by writing down your fragmented thoughts, the flashes and glimpses that you see, simply by writing them down in a way that can still be admired, you can still come up with a poem. All right? So that's the first thing I want you to know about poetry, that you do not need to have a complete thought. And by writing down the fragments of your imagination, you can still write a poem. Okay? I'm trying to go back to my PowerPoint. It takes me a bit of time to navigate between the two, but so far, hopefully, so good. I can't see any poem. Oh, Augusta, you missed it. Sorry. So nobody saw my screen when I shared it.
I saw the screen, but when you were asking about who knew the poem, I didn't see it. But I saw the screen.
Okay. That's good. Okay, so why does this thing give so much trouble? I'm trying to share my screen again. Just give me a minute. Okay, let me pull this up and then try and share it. Okay, there we go. All right, so the first thing, like I said, is that poetry deals with the incomplete sentence, the fragment of the sentence. We've been through this slide. So there I have put up a nice little picture to show you what I mean. That is the building block of poetry, the sentence fragment. And I showed you the example of Rudyard Kipling's If, and how the entire poem is a series of dependent clauses, not one complete sentence in it. So right at the end. Okay. Now the second thing about poetry is its unnatural flow. The unnatural flow of poetry. I'm going to try and define some very abstract concepts like flow. Poetry's flow is one of two unique features that makes it enjoyable, even when it is not understandable. We will return to this quality of something being enjoyable to read, even when it is beyond understanding, because it's a very, very important quality of poetry that you can enjoy it, even when you don't understand it. And one of the reasons why you can enjoy poetry, even when you don't understand it, is because of this thing called flow. Now, what is flow? What is flow? Flow, I thought about this thing long and hard. It's very difficult to explain what flow is. But flow is the rationale behind the sequencing in a body of work. It's the rationale behind sequencing in a body of work. I'll explain. Every piece of writing is constructed, like I showed you from above, from building blocks, okay? You construct a piece of writing by putting one building block after the other, like that. So in prose, for instance, a sentence follows a sentence, then another sentence, until the writing is done. In poetry, a line follows a line, then another line, until the poem is done. Either way, any piece of writing is an arrangement of its building blocks, okay? Just like you're building a house, it's an arrangement of its building blocks. And flow is the reason why every building block is where it is. It is why block A comes after block. It's why block B comes after block A, but before block C. Flow is what ties each element in your writing together. It is what ties an element to the one that came before it and the one that will come after it. It is the rationale behind the positioning of every element in your piece of writing, all right? So it explains why each element is where it is in the wider body of work. So flow is about sequence. Why does this follow this? Why does this come after that? Okay? In prose, flow is driven by logic. In prose, flow is driven by logic. The placing of a sentence depends entirely on the progression of the argument being made or the story being told. You put a sentence where it needs to be to progress an argument or to tell a story. It's very logical, okay? And a sentence will be as long, I said this before, a sentence will be as long as it needs to be to complete the thought it is carrying. A sentence in prose will be as long as it needs to be to complete the thought it is carrying. So prose cannot be written to a beat, to a count. A sentence cannot just end just because you're trying to keep to a count. You can't start a sentence and not end it in prose just because you're trying to keep to a beat. This is why prose cannot generate a rhythm. Prose cannot generate a rhythm. In poetry, however, flow is not driven by logic. The line that follows a line does not have to complete or in any way complete the thoughts that that first line was carrying, all right? A sentence can be broken off at any time. In between the beginning of a sentence and its end can be other phrases and clauses and sentences that have nothing to do with that sentence. A sentence you start in a poem, you don't even have to end it, okay? A sentence, a poem does not even, a phrase in a poem can stand alone as a stanza. One word can be a stanza, one line can be a stanza. A poem does not have to have comma, it does not have to have full stop, it does not even have to have stanzas. In a poem, a stanza does not even have to group together lines that relate to each other. Okay? So in short, in poetry, because there is no need to make sentences or to logically group them together, lines can be arranged in any way the poet pleases. In poetry, lines don't have to be arranged logically. They can be arranged in any way the poet pleases. So in poetry, flow is completely at the discretion of the poet, completely, unlike in prose. In poetry, flow is completely at the discretion of the poet. So if you see the slide, in prose, you go from A to B to C. In poetry, you can meander, you can go from A to V. You can have T up there that nobody even knows how T is connected to what you're saying. That's poetry. Flow is completely at the discretion of the poet. And for this reason, in poetry, the flow can be so subjective that it appears non-existent. You can read a poem and not even understand. It can just look like a random collection of thoughts that have no connection to each other. Only the poet knows how they connect to each other. All right? So in poetry, flow is completely at the discretion of the poet. Let me show you another example of a poem that has a very random flow. Okay, so I'm going to come out of this. I'm going to come out of this slide. I'm going to try and Google it again. This poem is called. Okay, you can still see my screen. That's good. This poem is called Mother Idoto by Christopher Okibo. Okay, the one I'm about to share now. Let's still do Poem Hunter. Okay, I hope, I'm sure we can all see it anyway. So this is Christopher Okibo's poem Mother Idoto. I don't know if people have read it before. It's one of, Christopher Okibo is one of our classical African poets. So most times you bump into him in school and he always gives you a headache because he's very obscure, all right? Now, if you read this poem, I'm not going to go through it, but I'll leave it there for you. You can read it another time. You might find it very random. You know, you might not even get what he's saying. You would understand the line, you know, like he would say, before you, my mother Idoto, naked I stand. It's English, you understand it. Before your weary presence, a prodigal, okay? Leaning on an oil beam, lost in your legend. Under your power, wait I on barefoot, watchman for the watchword at heaven's gate. All right, somebody is waiting, you know, it's making sense. Out of the depth my cry, give ear and hearken. And there is the ellipses or the ... And then he says, dark waters of the beginning. Now you may stop and wonder, okay, what is dark waters of the beginning? How does this connect with what he just said there? Ray, violet and short, piercing the gloom, foreshadow the fire that is dreamed of. Rainbow on far side, arched like boa, bent to kill, foreshadow of the fire that is dreamed of. Me to the orangery, solitude invite, a wagtail to tell the tangled. You know, after a while, it just starts becoming glimpses, and you may not understand, okay, well, how does this connect to what came before? How does it connect to what's coming next? There is a flow in it. It's just not hard to tell what the flow is because it's so subjective. It's deep, it's embedded deep in the poet's mind. We may have to have the poet sitting beside us to explain why he went from that imagery to that imagery to that imagery. There might be some people who get it, maybe because they think exactly like the poet, but a lot of people may just be like, I don't get it. So you may just understand, enjoy the English, but not understand the connection between the lines. That's what I mean by sometimes flow can be so random that it seems non-existent, okay? That's what that means. But conversely, because flow is completely at the discretion of the poet in a poem, it also means that in a poem, flow can be driven by a beat. Very important, unlike prose. In poetry, the poet can decide to drive the flow of the poem to a beat. Now, what is a beat? A beat is a regularly occurring sound or silence. So a beat is, this is me clapping my hand. That's a beat. It's just a regularly occurring sound or silence, like a metronome, tuck, 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 tuck. It is the building block of music, a steady count. So in poetry, you can construct a line to a count, to a beat. You can start a line that must end before the count of 4, or the count of 8, or the count of 16, all right? And once you make sound in keeping to a count, you are creating rhythm. That's all rhythm is. Rhythm is a sound that must start and end before a certain count. That's how you create rhythm. That's all it is. So once you write a line to a count, you create a rhythm that you can repeat periodically through the piece of writing. All right? So poetry can be written to a count and therefore produce a rhythm. So let's see another example of this, okay? Let's see an example of a poem written to a count. This time I'm going to be looking at Maya Angelou, Phenomenal Woman. So let's look for Maya Angelou, Phenomenal Woman. You are not giving me what I wish. Let's just Google it. Phenomenal Woman by Maya Angelou. Poetry Hunter, something like that. Yeah. Okay. So this is Maya Angelou's Phenomenal Woman. We're trying to look at an example of a poem that has some kind of count and therefore has some sort of rhythm. Now already from the structure, you can tell that there is rhythm. You can tell that there must be some rhythm because just looking at it, you can see that visually, structurally, the stanzas appear to resemble each other, particularly the first and the last, even in structure. So you can tell that there must be a count, there must be a rhythm that the poem is following for the lines to be ending at about the same place all the time, okay? So it says, pretty women wonder where my secret lies. I'm not cute or built to suit a fashion model size. But when I start to tell them, they think I'm telling lies. I say, it's in the reach of my arms, the span of my hips, the stride of my step, the curl of my lips. I'm a woman, phenomenally. Phenomenal woman, that's me. So we see that the first 4 lines of that stanza, there is a count. The count changes in the middle. So there are 3 counts in the stanza. The first 4 lines have a count of their own. The middle 5 or 6 lines have a count of their own. And then you have the last 4 lines that have a count of their own. And you will see that this is what is repeated through the entire poem. I walk into a room just as cool as you please, and to a man, the fellows stand or fall down to their knees. Then they swam around me a hive of bees. She stops. I say, it's like almost like a chorus now. I say, there's a fire in my eyes and a flash of my teeth, a swing in my way, da 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 da. I'm a woman, phenomenally. Phenomenal woman, that's me. Rhythm. You go to the next one. Men themselves have wondered what they see in me. They try so much, but they can't touch my inner mystery. When I try to show them, they say they still can't see. Finish. I say, move to the next one. It's in the arch of my back, the sun of my smile, the right of my breast, the da 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 da. Stop. I'm a woman. Phenomenally. Phenomenal woman. That's so rhythm. She's creating a rhythm because she's writing to a count. Okay? So because flow is completely at the discretion of the poet can write to a count and therefore write to a rhythm. All right? So this means that poetry can have a rhythm. Prose cannot. Very important. This is an important feature of poetry. This capacity to generate a rhythm is one of 2 reasons why poetry can be enjoyed even when you don't understand what it is saying. All right, you can just enjoy the rhythm, even when you don't understand what poetry is saying. So we've looked at 2 distinguishing features of poetry. One, its unusual construction, the fact that you construct it from fragments of sentences rather than a sentence, which means that you don't have to have a complete thought to write poetry. 2, the fact that flow in poetry is at the discretion of the poet. So things can flow in any way the poet desires, including in step to a beat, generating rhythm. All right? Now, the third distinguishing feature of poetry is its abnormal use of language. Its abnormal use of language. This is the second reason why poetry can be enjoyed even when it is not understood. The abnormal use of language. By abnormal use of language, I mean the figurative use of language. My people, this is the bread and butter. This is the cocoa. This is the soul, the spirit, the heart, the essence. If you cannot do this, you cannot be a poet. The figurative use of language. The figurative, in fact, if you cannot do this, you cannot be a writer. The figurative use of, this is our bread and butter. This is what we do. Figurative use of language is what poetry majors in. That is the non-literal use of language. That is using words to convey meanings different from their normal, everyday, literal meaning. So while poetry uses language in its literal sense, poetry can get away with using language in its literal sense. Prose can get away with using language in its literal sense. Poetry cannot. Poetry cannot. If I read a poem that has no figurative expression, it is not a poem, it is prose. Poetry cannot. Poetry majors in the figurative use of language. All right? Above every other thing, this is the distinguishing hallmark of poetry. So that if prose points a finger in a direction and says, now there goes a cat, okay? You turn around expecting to see a cat. But if poetry points a finger in a direction and says, now there goes a cat, you turn around with wonder, expecting to see anything but a cat. Because that is what poetry is. It is the mind bender of the literal family, of the literary family. Poetry is that member of the literary family that uses words in a way that makes the audience go, wow, how did you do that? For it says one thing, but you hear another. It's magic. And this unusual use of language is so striking, or can, in the hands of a master, can be so striking that it holds the attention and commands the admiration of the reader, even when he or she is not altogether certain what the poet is actually talking about. That is poetry. All right? That figurative use of language. So there you have it. Definition of poetry. Poetry is a form of literature in which the writer is permitted to construct lines from sentence fragments, arrange those lines in a sequence that is not driven by logic, in a sequence that is completely at the discretion of the poet, and use those lines, use those words and expressions to refer to things other than the things they normally refer to. This is my own definition of poetry. It is that form of literature in which the writer is permitted to construct lines from sentence fragments, arrange them in a sequence that is not driven by logic, and use them to refer to things other than the things they normally refer to. In short, poetry is a complete and total non-conformist to any of the normal rules of writing. Poetry is a freak of nature. To borrow an expression from my culture, in my culture, oh, thank you. No trouble. Okay. Sorry, people. To borrow an expression from my culture, poetry is a freak of nature. To borrow an expression from my culture, we have masquerades in Igbo culture. And those masquerades come out, in the marketplace to dance. And they typically have handlers, young men, typically young men, that follow the masquerade around. They play music for the masquerade. Some of the more dangerous masquerades, they will have the masquerade on a leash. A handler will be holding the masquerade on a leash. Somebody is playing the music for the masquerade is dancing to the music. That is how masquerades are. But there are some weird masquerades. In Igbo, we say, Mauna Koron Weyegu. These are masquerades that they beat their own music and they dance to their own music. Unlike other masquerades that have somebody else is beating the music, the masquerade is just performing to it. They are the weird masquerades that create the music that they are themselves dancing to. In the literary family, poetry is that weird masquerade that itself plays the music that it dances to. Poetry makes up its own rules. It draws up its own template. It picks its own flow. It decides for itself what words will mean in a poem. Imagine that. Poetry, more than any other literary form, is entirely amorphous, innately experimental. It can be anything. And that is why poetry, more than any other literary form, possesses the capacity to elevate language to unprecedented levels of artistry and power. To unprecedented levels of artistry and power because of the freedom the poet has when creating. Now, I say artistry and power. I use the word artistry deliberately because poetry can be admired. Poetry can be gazed at. It can be looked upon. Poetry can be listened to even when you are reading it. Poetry can be listened to even when you are reading it. It can be enjoyed independently of what it is saying. So the way a poem uses structure can be stared at in awe. The same way you stare at a picture or a painting, you can just look at the construction of a stanza. You can just look at where the stanza is placed on a page, and that alone can cause you to pause for a second or two in admiration. You haven't even read the poem. Its flow, particularly where it is driven by a beat, can be followed with enjoyment the same way you would follow the rhythm of a song. So you saw how when we're reading Maya Angelou's poem, you can just be saying da 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 da. You don't even need the words. You can listen to the rhythm. The striking expressions that poetry creates to say things can be marveled at. The same way that in which you would marvel at a new invention, for instance, like a telescope that suddenly brings a distant star into sharp perspective. Somebody can just hit you with a phrase and you're just like, man, just take a second and just admire how the person said that thing. These are qualities of a poem that can be enjoyed independently of what the poem as a whole is saying. In this sense, if I were to put it mathematically, poetry elevates language to the point where the value of a single line is greater than the sum of the value of its individual parts. Poetry elevates language to the point where the value of a single line is greater than the sum of the value of its individual parts. For poetry, in its use of structure, rhythm, and figurative expression, can create a second level of value, enjoyable as art in itself by the reader, separate from the message of the poem. This capacity of poetry to function as a means of communication on one hand, but also as an independent art, enjoyable independently of the message being communicated, is what I mean by the duality of poetry. The duality of poetry. You can see on the slide, in the middle, that's the human brain. We're told that the right side is the artist's brain, the left side is the rational brain, or whatever it is. You know, it's just a very broad categorization of the brain. One side sort of appreciates artistic and creative things. The other side appreciates rational thought. Well, a poem provides both. So a poem can be read for its message, can engage your logic, your reason, the rational part of your brain. But a poem can also be enjoyed for its visual and auditory quality. That is for its rhythm, the way it looks, its use of expression. You can be enjoying these things without knowing what the poem is talking about. That is why a good poem scatters the brain, because it engages every aspect of the brain. It puts everything in gear. So right side, left side, a poem can be enjoyed as a message, and a poem can be enjoyed as art. This is what I mean by the duality of poetry. And it does distinguish poetry a lot from prose. The fact that poetry can function both as a genre of literature in its own right, but also as a literary tool for communication that is indispensable to every other genre of literature. And we'll come back to that and we'll look at really what prospects. We haven't begun to tap the potential of poetry, I tell you. We haven't begun to tap it. The dual function of poetry, let's look at that. Poetry as a literary tool for communication. That is poetry synonymous with figurative expression or the use of figures of speech. In this sense, poetry is a way of amplifying the meaning of words, a way of saying something people are used to hearing in a way that makes them feel like they are hearing it for the first time. That's what a figure of speech does. This is what I call the functional use of poetry in support of communication. You're communicating a message. You want to communicate it effectively. My brother, my sister, the best way to do this is with poetry. In this sense, poetry can help to add power and force to the telling of a story, any story, or the delivery of a message, any message. It can make words striking and therefore unforgettable for the audience. No writer, no matter the genre of literature in which they work, can avoid the intelligent use of poetry in the creation of phrases and expressions that can cause ordinary words to pack an extraordinary punch. This is the functional use of poetry as a means of effective communication. But there is also the aesthetic use of poetry. Aesthetic, to create beauty. That additional layer of meaning generated in poetry can be enjoyed in itself, separate from the underlying words. This is the aesthetic use of poetry, where even when you have no interest in or understanding of the words themselves or what the words themselves are saying, you are still able to enjoy the way they are used in the poem. Unique phrases, fascinating turns of expression, beautiful figures of speech that make you click your tongue in appreciation and say, chai! Language used more for the sake of enjoying language, of showcasing expression, enjoying the beauty and fluidity of expression, using language in that sense, rather than as a way of conveying objective, concrete meaning. You can enjoy the way the poem looks. You can enjoy the rhythm it creates. These are the dual functions of poetry. A functional role to aid communication, an aesthetic role to create an art that is independent of meaning. Okay? These two roles of poetry is what gives rise to the three broad categories of poetry that exist. Three kinds of poetry you can write. There are three broad kinds of poetry that anybody can write. In the old days, they used to be categorized as epic poetry, dramatic poetry, and lyrical poetry. But I'm going to change it up a bit so that I can make certain things evident. So the fact that poetry can be used to deliver a message, and poetry can also be used to create art independent of message and meaning, gives rise to the three broad kinds of poetry that anybody can write. Remember at the beginning, I was asking you, well, what kinds of poetry do you write? Well, there are only three broad types of poetry that anybody can write, really. Number one, these are now my expressions or my labels, you know. It doesn't matter what I label it. What is important is what type of poetry it is. Number one is what I call storytelling poetry. All right? That's the first type of poetry you can write. On the number one, we're looking at storytelling poetry. It can also be called narrative poetry. That is when you use poetry to tell a traditional story. And by traditional, I mean a story with all the typical elements of a story. That means a story that has a plot, characters, character development, dialogue, story progression, you understand? So you use a poem to tell a traditional type of story. This is actually one of the oldest uses of poetry, to tell stories. But by putting a story into a poem, by putting a story into stanzas with rhythm and rhyme, and the intelligent use of memorable figures of expression, the storyteller makes the story easy to recall and easy to retell. So poetry is an aid for memory. Many times I'm asked, because I do poetry shows that last for 2 hours, and people say, how do you remember your lines? I remember them because they are poems. A poem is much easier to remember than an essay, because that is what it does. And so before the age of writing, poetry was synonymous with storytelling because it aided memorization and recall, and therefore helped to store and transfer information across generations. All right? That's why those old stories in oral cultures that don't have writing, you find that stories are very rhythmic, are very poetic, because poetry helps you remember. Okay? So, and when you're telling a story with a poem, the story can have multiple characters with dialogue. It can have a single character. The entire poem can be a monologue. Examples of this are like, if you know the Iliad or the Odyssey by Homer, you know, just epic poetry, works of Shakespeare, or for us, maybe Wole Soyinka's telephone conversation, for instance, you know, a dialogue between somebody trying to rent a flat and the prospective landlord. So these are all examples of storytelling poetry. If you write a poem that has a story, that tells a story, that has at least one character, dialogue and progression, you are writing storytelling poetry. Okay? So that's the first broad category of poetry. The second broad category of poetry is what I call proselytizing poetry. To proselytize means to preach or to teach or to, you know. So this is when poetry is used to communicate a concise, well thought out and comprehensive message. So you've sat down, you've thought this thing out, you have a comprehensive message in your mind, you want to pass it across, you want to convince, convict the audience, and you write and you deliver that poetry, that message through poetry. You're writing proselytizing poetry. It is the type of poetry that is used to deliver a systematic body of thoughts, beliefs, or knowledge to an audience. It is not like storytelling poetry in which you're telling a story. The story may have a moral, but you're telling a story. No, in this case, the point the poet is making is very much in the foreground of the poem. It's very much in the front of the poem. The poet may choose or choose not to, but may choose to illustrate the point with various scenarios. So I can have little micro stories that are illustrating a point, but I'm making a point. So the poet, he or she, is focused not on entertaining through storytelling, but on communicating a point to the audience. In proselytizing poetry, the poet functions like a teacher or a preacher or a motivational speaker, if you like. An example of this type of poetry is, for those that you may not know it, but it's The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. If you have time, look it up. Khalil Gibran, The Prophet. Or even J.P. Clark's The Casualties. These are advocacy. This is advocacy poetry, poetry that has a message. It can be a political message, it can be a spiritual message, it can be a moral message. It has a message, it hammers its message. So if you write poetry in which you have well thought out beliefs, knowledge, information that you wish adopted and pushed on others, you are writing proselytizing poetry. All right? It's also communication oriented, like storytelling poetry. The last broad category of poetry is what the ancient Greeks called lyrical poetry. I couldn't find another word, but so I used it as well, lyrical poetry, even though lyrical doesn't really say what it means. But now this is the poetry that we have all been talking about. When I ask people, tell me about how you came to poetry, What motivated you to write poetry? What kind of poetry do you write? The 2, 3, 4 people that spoke all spoke about lyrical poetry. This is when you use poetry to express your feelings or your thoughts that are not quite fully processed about anything. This is what differentiates lyrical poetry from proselytizing poetry, in that in proselytizing poetry, you are expressing well thought out positions with the intention of convicting others. In lyrical poetry, you're not interested in any of that. Lyrical poetry takes you into the subconscious rather than the rational mind of the poet. It invites you to see the world through the poet's inner eyes, to see a situation the poet has not quite grasped intellectually. So the poet is processing a situation they've not quite grasped intellectually, right? So it seeks to communicate not a defined position, but it seeks to communicate a mood, a feeling, an array of thoughts that have not yet been synthesized into a cohesive intellectual concept. In this sense, lyrical poetry seeks to communicate the poet's state of mind, whether that state of mind is wonder or confusion, depression, or it seeks to communicate the poet's state of mind rather than the poet's opinion on anything. It is focused on self-expression, not on communication. It seeks to share an emotional or mental space with the reader, similar to inviting someone to sit on a bench and watch a sunset with you, as opposed to inviting them to come and attend a lecture that you are giving. In lyrical poetry, the poet writes down his or her thoughts as close as possible to the way they popped and fizzled in his or her mind in the moment. Lyrical poetry is in the moment. So the poet has not yet had time to sit down and process things. As the poet is writing, these things are being processed. So the poet is not primarily concerned with making sense to you, but with writing what he or she sees, making sense to himself or herself. That's what the poet is concerned about. Lyrical poetry is the expression of the turbulent world of the subconscious. And I've already shown you an example, Christopher Okigbu's mother, Idoto. If you write poetry on topics on which you have a lot of feelings, intense feelings, but half-formed, half-processed thoughts, then you are writing lyrical poetry, where there is lots of feelings, where you're in the moment, where you're processing as you're writing, where you're writing for yourself as much as you're writing for anybody else, then you're writing lyrical poetry. So these are the broad kinds of poetry you can write: storytelling poetry, proselytizing poetry, or lyrical poetry. Okay? So I'm going to do a quick recap here because we're going to have a conversation now. I started by telling you poetry has no definition. You have to describe it. The best description of poetry is that it is not prose. It does not construct language normally. It does not follow a normal flow, and it does not use words in their normal meanings. We looked at the 3 distinguishing features of poetry. It constructs language, it builds itself using fragments of sentences rather than sentences. The flow is at the discretion of the poet, so it can also be written to a beat and generate a rhythm. And lastly, it uses words figuratively, not literally, not normally. And because of these 3 characteristics, poetry is able to carry out a dual function. As in, it can be used to communicate on one hand, it can also be used to generate art that can be enjoyed independently of meaning. And because of this dual nature of poetry, there are 3 broad kinds of poetry: those that lean towards communication, and those that lean towards just generating art. So you have your storytelling poetry, when you use poetry to tell a complete story. You have your proselytizing poetry, when you use poetry to preach or teach or push out a concise message. And then lyrical poetry, when you use poetry to purge your own soul, to explore your own subconscious. Okay? So at this point, I would like to ask people to sort of think about this schematic and how it applies to them. I'd like you to ask yourself, why do you write poetry? And what type of poetry do you think you write naturally? When I say, why do you write poetry? I mean, from the angle of, am I trying to tell people a story? Am I trying to push out a particular message on society? Am I just purging myself? What's your motivation? And looking at what you yourself, looking back at what you've written, what kind of poetry do you write naturally out of that broad category of poetry? Okay, so I'm just going to sort of hear back from you on how you, network is terrible. Debbie, I hope you're able to hear sort of what we're talking about. So I'm going to go through the people that are still here. Aisha, how does this help you recategorize yourself as a poet? What kind of poetry do you write? What's your motivation for writing poetry? Yeah.
Okay. Based on the types of poetry that you listed, I would say that I'm a lyrical poet.
Right. And what is your, in terms of motivation, what would you like to do with poetry? Would you like to entertain? Would you like to convict? Or would you just like people to share your world, your inner world?
Yes, it's actually a mixture of two things. I would first
Hello. Hello. We've lost Aisha for a second there.
like people to see things the way I send a message.
Okay, I think Aisha said it's about getting people to see things through her eyes. Okay. I can't see the poem. I can't see it. Okay, let me try somebody else. Network. We're struggling with network issues, but we shall prevail. Umi has been here from the beginning. So Umi, what about you? What's your motivation for writing? To entertain, to convict, preach, teach, or just simply to invite people to come and see how I see things? Umi, what kind of poetry do you write?
Okay, so I would say lyrical, because I want people to like share my world, and like I said earlier, I use poetry to heal because I'm still healing. So and at the same time, I feel like my poems give life to people, you know, like people relate with my poems, so it gives life to people, you know. It's like a safe space for people to like disappear.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay. That's good. And we're going to, I looked at 2 of your poems, Umi, and we'll talk about it a bit towards the end. Okay.
Okay.
Fumi, what about you? What's your motivation and what type of poetry comes naturally to you?
Okay, hi.
Hi.
Okay, so lyrical poems actually come naturally to me because it's somewhat of like a purgative for me. It's like, okay, there are a lot of things going through my head.
Yeah.
So it's an opportunity for me to tell the world what I'm going through.
Yeah.
But at the same time, off and on, I feel like at some point I actually do a little bit of the other two.
Yeah.
But those ones don't usually come naturally. It's just okay, maybe something happens and it just kind of triggers a lot of emotions and everything.
Yeah. Understood. Thank you for me. Essie, what about you? Essie.
Hi.
Hi.
Afternoon.
Afternoon.
Okay, I think for me, I definitely do lyrical. And even if I like the idea of, would I say activism poetry, the one where you want to convince other people, those are the kind of poems I like more. But that's not what I actually do. I'm still, actually, I don't share my poems publicly. And I don't think anybody has read any of my pieces. But I think what I do is lyric, and I think what I would like to do is activism. But for now, I think the one girl that came before, something about the healing. Yes, I think, no, the one of healing. I think that's the one that just
lyrical. Yeah.
So I think that's my stance for now.
Okay. The first thing is to get you to start sharing your poems publicly. Then we'll start. That's where to start. Okay. Al Hassan. Hello, Al Hassan. Are you able to speak? Okay, Al Hassan isn't responding. What up?
Hello.
Hello, Al Hassan.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so for me, I think I write more of proselytizing poetry.
Yeah.
Because I try
Get it. Your network is, we're struggling with your network.
Like convict to sort of what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Hello.
I can hear you now. Well, now you've got into the space age again. Intergalactic communications. But we get the point. I get the point. Proselytizing, you try to convince, you try to convict. Okay. I'm going to ask, hope you guys can hear now.
So to question that.
Yes, and then the admin just reminded us, whenever your network is acting up, you can just type in what you're trying to say. So if you have questions, even as I'm speaking, if you have questions, contrary opinions, or what about this, or what about that, just type it in. So I go back and I read up and see what people said. Vera, what about you? What kind of poetry do you write? Vera has had issues with speaking. Debbie, what kind of poetry do you write? I think Debbie has been in and out. Okay. Now, the first thing, I just wanted people to be able to locate themselves. Like I said, poetry can be anything, so it can just be floating around. So those of you that write lyrical poetry, and many people write lyrical poetry. It is the kind of poetry that almost everybody begins poetry with, because like I said, you know, it's emotions, it's frustration, pent up anger, pent up pain that brings a lot of people to poetry. So lyrical poetry is a natural first for many people. But it's very important to understand that there is a universe of poetry out there. There's a universe of poetry out there. That lyrical poetry is just an entry point into the world, into the galaxy of poetry. All right? And the first thing I'd like you to begin to do from today is to experiment and task yourself. take your craft seriously. So don't just write the poetry that you feel like writing. Esther, just like you said, oh, you know, this is the poetry I write naturally, but I would like to write this kind of poetry. You know, task yourself as an exercise and write a different kind of poetry. Write a story, but write it in poetry. You know, preach a message, teach a course. You know, when these are things I did as a I read law in school. And there are, you know, when you read law, you read your cases and then you write, you know, what the case says and the principles of law that were laid down in the case. Sometimes I'll take a case and I'll make a poem out of it. I'll take the whole case, the conversation between the judge and the defendant. I'll write it in poetry and write down what the law is in poetry. These were just exercises I did for myself to improve my range, to improve my ability, so that I can write these 3 different types of poetry. Yeah, so Vera says she dabbles into all types of poetry, except the storytelling poetry. Good. I write lyrical poetry and storytelling poetry. Good. So I would like to challenge everybody to, as an exercise, as a way of building your muscle as a poet, don't just write the poetry that comes to you naturally. Don't just write the poetry that you're comfortable with. Stretch and say, okay, let me write a process. I remember these are my terms. You know, you can call it whatever you want. But let me write a proselytizing type of poem, an advocacy type of poem. Okay, now I want to, you know, this is an anti-chauvinism poem. This is an anti-rape poem. Okay, let me write an anti-rape poem. I want people to know that this is bad and this is how I want them to think. Okay, I have a story. Rather than writing a short story or writing it in prose, I'm going to write it in a poem. I'm going to use stanzas and rhyme and everything. And I'm going to have dialogue and characters and, you know, because lyrical poem is the easiest to write. Lyrical poem is also the hardest to improve in because it can be anything. You know, you cannot come and tell me this is how I feel and I'll tell you that no, it is wrong. You can't judge or critique how somebody feels or how they see the world. It is innately subjective. So I'll just listen and say, okay, nice. Because it's for you. If it works for you, then it works. All right. So it's also the hardest kind of poetry to develop in because you can always hide behind, that's the way I see it. That's how I, you know, and that's it. So in a way, it can also limit your growth as a poet and as a writer. So sometimes you also write things that can be critiqued objectively so that somebody can say, okay, this is weak, and you can accept it rather than saying, oh, well, that is how I see the world or that is how I feel. But because yes, the point is not to judge how you feel, but how you are expressing how you are feeling. So there has to be times when you begin to allow people access to that, to really critique how you express this thing without giving yourself the option of running behind, well, that's how I feel it, or that's how I see it, or, you know. So the first, I try to question narratives in my poetry, yes. You know, that is also very, very deeply that is also within proselytizing world of poetry, you know, where you challenge mainstream thinking, you know. So for instance, I'm a poet that often likes to challenge tribalism, the thinking behind tribalism. And many times I sit down and my challenge is, how do I translate something I have thought about sort of rationally? How do I translate it into a poem, you know, that makes people see that, oh, tribalism may not be correct or it's wrong or think in a different way. So that's very proselytizing in nature, where you have an agenda, conscious agenda. They always go around telling us artists that, oh, you don't need to have an agenda. But, you know, like I said, there is a universe of poetry out there. It's not just lyrical. It's not just subconscious. It's not just, you know, follow your stream of consciousness kind of thing. That's just one aspect of poetry. So I want you to, as poets, begin to flex your muscle and develop capacities in other areas. It will help you even when you come back to write what naturally comes to you. It will help you because some other types of poetry require a greater level of discipline, a greater level of tasking yourself than when you're just sort of spilling your guts on paper, okay? So that's that on that note. Now, any tips on how to write long poetry and still make sense? Yeah, we're actually going into the tips section. The next thing we're going to be looking at is how to write good poetry. So we're going to be sharing some practical tips and looking at some of the poems entries that were sent in. I don't know if I wasn't able to go through everybody's. I read everybody's poem. I wasn't able to edit and make comments. So I'll use some people's work to illustrate certain things, or I may. And then, so we're going exactly to that now, Debbie. Okay. So let me go back to my PowerPoints. And so now the topic is writing good poetry. How do we write good poetry? Okay. So here we're going to have more practical tips. The first part was very conceptual, just to help you think about the poetry space and perhaps locate yourself within the poetry space. Now we're going to be looking at practical tips on how to improve yourself in the poetry space. Normally, if we were all in a room, I'll have taken a break now. But because we're all at home, I guess, do we need to do like 5 minutes or 10 minutes, or is everybody good to go? You can just type in your response if you're good to go. I was asking if we can go on, or do we need a 10-minute break or a 15-minute break? Any responses? Are we good to go? Let's take a break, as it says. 10 minutes, please, from Fumi. Okay, I think it'll be good to do a break. So, okay, let's do a 15-minute break. This is roughly 12 noon. Let's come back by 12:15. 12:15. Is that okay? Great. Okay, so good. So 12:15. So so I'll see everybody. We'll start up again at 12:15, please. See you guys in 15 minutes. Even me, I need to drink water. So this talking is not easy. Go easy. Thank you, Essay. Good to have you guys back. Went to have a glass of water. Okay, so poetry. We started from very conceptual things. I always just like looking at things conceptually first, understanding what I do, why I do it, before I come down to the hands-on thing. Because for me, 80% of everything is how you see things or how you understand things. That always affects how productive you are. So we talked about went from what is poetry and how it's hard to define because it's so subjective. And so it's always better to describe its distinguishing features. And we talked about its the unusual way in which it constructs language using fragments of sentences, phrases, conditional clauses. Anything can be used to construct poetry. It doesn't have to be a sentence. We talked about its unusual flow. Poetry can flow however the poet wants it to flow. And therefore the poet can make it flow to a beat and generate rhythm, which poetry is famous for, rhythm. Rhyme is a form of rhythm, by the way, but that's another topic. And then we also talked about how poetry makes abnormal use of language, so it uses language figuratively. And that because poetry, constructs language unusually, goes to an unusual rhythm, uses unusual meanings, it's able to generate an art that can be admired, listened to, looked at, separate from what the poetry is saying, and that's the dual nature of poetry. So it can be functional, you can use it to communicate, you can use it to talk and improve how well you deliver your message. And you can just use it to impress, to awe, to dazzle and just showcase itself. And because poetry has this dual nature, you have three broad types of poetry that come out of that. Talked about the storytelling type of poetry, which in the would have been referred to as epic poetry or ballads, poetry that tells a story. And then we talked about the proselytizing type of poetry, which is a term I coined, just to sort of capture that segment of poetry that is very pointed, has a message. It could be spiritual, it could be political, it could be moral, but it's really focused on its messaging. And then we talked about the lyrical poetry, which is the sort of the poetry most people start off with, are familiar with. So the poetry of self-expression and in interrogating your own subjective experiences and exploring your own subconscious. And I ended by encouraging everyone to expand your range. So don't just write what you're comfortable with. Give yourself tasks every day. Let me write a story in a poem. Let me do an advocacy in a poem, and then do your normal lyrical poetry. This will help you build capacity across board, which always helps. A writer must be able to write different kinds of things, not just one type of thing all the time. So now we're moving on to the topic and, my own life journey as a poet. I told you at the beginning, I started out as a lyrical poet. Poetry was expressing hurt, expressing pain, expressing disappointment, grappling with the world as a young boy, grappling with the world as a teenager, going into university. I was 17 when I went into university, grappling with the world of semi-adulthood. Poetry was an emotional crutch that helped me get through all these things. But over time I've developed, and I also used to do a lot of storytelling poetry because I'm also a storyteller. I started writing novels at about the same time I started writing poetry. So I've always liked telling stories. And so I did a lot of lyrical poetry and a lot of storytelling. And I can tell you my background in storytelling poetry is one of, I consider my biggest advantages as a poet today. It makes me very versatile as a poet because I know how to tell stories in poetry. It's not an easy skill to have that. Maybe I should do a workshop on that one day, but it takes me time to break these things down. I have to actually think about it because I do them intuitively. So I started out writing lyrical and storytelling poetry, really. But over time, I've become more of an advocacy poet, a proselytizing poet, because that stage or that chapter of my poetry, my life as a poet began after I did my master's. I did a master's in law and development after I finished from school, and I was very intrigued with the idea of this first world, third world. Why is there a first world and a third world? Why are some countries, poor and other countries are rich? And these are very socioeconomic and political questions, and then I set out to translate this body of knowledge into poetry. That was how I actually wrote my first poetry collection titled The Revolution Has No Tribe. It was trying to translate my master's thesis into a work of poetry. Sort of like a project, a pet project, just like this thing I'm asking you to do, just give yourself a task as a poet, push yourself. And it opened up a whole new chapter of poetry for me, just advocacy poetry, how to use poetry to effectively push a message. And so when I was categorizing, if you go and look at sort of classical categorizations of poetry, you'll see that they categorize it into epic poetry, which is sort of similar to what I call storytelling poetry. Then they have a second category that they call dramatic poetry, which to me is still storytelling poetry, just poetry where there's a character talking, where the poem is a character talking, which is just storytelling poetry. And then, so the classical categorizations of poetry are epic poetry, dramatic poetry, and lyrical poetry. But from my own experience, I feel like there is storytelling poetry, there's lyrical poetry, but there's that advocacy poetry that nobody really centers on. But it is something that I discovered as a poet, that there's a kind of poetry where you are focused on the messaging. You are like a speaker, a public speaker, just that you're using poetry as your vehicle. So these are things that, so the more you push yourself as a poet, the more you challenge yourself, the more you can actually discover undiscovered or unexplored areas of poetry. It's a vast field and its potential has not yet been fully tapped. Okay, so anyway, now we're going to look at how to write good poetry. So in this session, the next 1.5 hours, hopefully, so we can wrap up by 2-ish or in 2 hours. I don't know what time it is, where everybody is. So we're looking at now how to write good poetry. And I'm going to start off a bit by just asking, what exactly do you mean by good poetry? All right. Let me put up my PowerPoint again, just so that you're not just having to stare at my face. You can look at something else. There you are. Yeah, so we're looking at writing good, how do you write good poetry? So I want to start by asking that question, what is good poetry? There's a nice pyramid there for you. And I'll explain what it says. In truth, deciding what good poetry is as difficult as defining poetry itself. So it is good that we spent a lot of time just describing poetry, because in the end, a thing has to be judged by how well it accomplishes its purpose. And I've told you that poetry has 2 broad purposes, a functional one in support of communication, and then an aesthetic one in support of creating an art that is enjoyable independently of messaging. So in this sense, a good poem is a poem that fulfills either one or both of those purposes. So a good poem would be a poem that, 1, succeeds in communicating a message or story powerfully, effectively, or 2, a poem that makes fascinating use of structure, flow, figurative expression to create a sensory experience that the reader can enjoy independent of the poem's message. Or finally, a poem that does both. So you have sort of three categories of what a good poem is. A poem that communicates effectively, a poem that is a brilliant work of art that can be viewed and listened to and enjoyed independent of the message, and then a poem that does both, that is both visually, artistically sound, and also has a coherent and powerful message. Now, it goes without saying that a poem that can do both would be the ideal poem. That's why it's sitting at the top of that pyramid. The ideal poem will communicate an effective message and will also be a work of art in itself, in its structure, in its rhythm, in its flow, in its use of language. That's the ideal poem. It does it both. And that would make it a masterpiece of masterpieces. And that is why it sits on the top there. And I'm sure that in your career as a poet, if you write 1,000 poems, maybe only 2 or 3 of them would be ideal. Which is another reason why, as a poet, you must write. The more you write, the more likely that one of them would be really good. But every poet writes at the bottom lots of junk, in the middle, okay, and then at the top, the best. So write a lot. So the ideal poem sits at the top. It does both. It communicates the message effectively, and it is in itself a work of art. Now, so clearly there's some sort of ranking within the category of good poetry. There is ideal poetry, which in turn forces a comparison between functional poetry, poetry that is only functional, that is, it communicates effectively, and aesthetic poetry, poetry that looks and sounds good, but the message you may not understand or know. Which one of them is higher in ranking? This is a huge debate for many poets. If the ideal is largely unattainable, if a poet must routinely compromise between functionality and aesthetics, which is the better compromise? Which type of poem, functional or aesthetic, should rank just below the ideal as the classical poem? And which should be ranked last as the minimum a poet must do to be admitted into the category of good poetry? Okay? If you are a practicing poet, you will not have practiced your trade for too long before bumping into this debate in one way or the other. Over time, the debate has moved back and forth. In some ages, functionality is prized over aesthetics. In other ages, aesthetics is prized or valued over functionality. Today, however, it is largely the case that the classical poem is regarded as the aesthetic poem, the poem that thrills the reader more with its structure, flow, and use of figurative expression than it does with the logic or moral force of its message. Today, the classical poem is a poem that can be looked upon with awe as a work of art in itself, without taking into consideration the coherence of the poet's message. In this sense, today, the lyrical poem, with its whimsical structure and flow and fascinating expression of half-formed thoughts, which need not share a logical connection, is considered the classical poem. Okay, but as stated above, it is a shifting debate. And one of the drivers of the shifts in this debate is the state of society itself. For the debate between aesthetics and functionality in poetry is part of a larger debate about the role of art in society. Is art a means of helping its consumers escape the ugly realities of society? Or is art a tool for provoking them into confronting these realities? These are two very strong schools of thoughts about how art should be used in society. Now, generally in times of great social upheavals, when society is standing at critical crossroads, it becomes harder to successfully make the argument that art should be made and enjoyed for its sake alone. When society is struggling with tyrannical leadership, or the number of children sleeping in the streets is rising, when people are dying in numbers from preventable diseases, and ignorance and illiteracy is mortgaging the future of communities. In these circumstances, it is difficult to justify selling a poem for its structure, flow, and enigmatic use of unusual phrases. In situations like this, a poem is under pressure to have a more utilitarian function. It must give the reader something functional, something they need to overcome the challenges that they are themselves facing. And this something can sometimes be a fleeting sense of happiness, But more often than not, it must be hope, faith, knowledge, capacity, a plan of action, a useful insight into an intractable problem, motivation, a strategy. A poem in these situations is under pressure to deliver something the reader finds practical and usable in his own or her own life. This means that in situations where society is in a state of upheaval, a poem is under pressure. It cannot just be an invitation for the reader to come and view how happy or complicated or eccentric or eclectic or talented the poet is. No, it needs to also put something in the reader's hands that he or she can walk away and use in his or her own life. This is what it means to be communication oriented. It means to write, not with the primary objective of getting things off your chest, but with the primary objective of getting things across to the reader. So it's not just talking, but it's talking to be heard. So in these times when society is asking tough questions and is in desperate need of answers, answers upon which the well-being, the security, the health, the education of millions of people depend, the poet is under pressure to be oriented less towards subjective self-expression and more towards objective communication. In such situations, the poet must consider the social relevance of his or her poem and how effectively it speaks to the needs of his or her time or society. Now, today on the African continent, we are living in such times. We are in a continent in search of its place in the world. Today, all around the world, we live in such times. We are in a world plagued by the contradictions of globalization, because the evolution of a global village means that people and cultures that were previously separated by geography, by oceans and mountains, by differences in time zones, by the difficulties and dangers of long distance travel, such people and cultures have now been placed next to each other by these advances in communication and transportation technology. Today, everybody is everybody's neighbor. And as we have reaped the benefits of this in expanded networks and opportunities for collaboration, we are also saddled with its costs in increasing sectarian and identity-based conflicts, white versus black, male versus female, Christian versus Muslim, Western versus Eastern, North versus South, straight versus gay, conservative versus liberal, Hausa versus Igbo, science versus intuition. Human interaction will always generate conflict. And these conflicts have understandably been heightened in a world where human beings are now interacting on a global scale. And that is why one of the deepest and most pervasive needs of our times today, both on the continent of Africa, both in Nigeria, in Africa, around the world, is the need for empathy. Empathy, in simple words, is to see the world through the eyes of the other person. It is to understand where the other person is coming from. It is to recognize that beneath the sectarian and identity-based differences, we share the same planet, we share the same biological origins, we share the same emotional template, we share the same life struggles, we share the same humanity. We laugh, we cry, we hurt, we long that our children have better lives than we do. Empathy breeds tolerance. It tempers hate. It moderates revulsion. It accommodates a wide range of views and perspectives. Empathy is indispensable in a multicultural world. And how do you create empathy? By effectively exchanging perspectives, by transferring one person's point of view to the other person and vice versa, not by talking at each other. We create empathy by talking to be heard, by hearing what the other person is saying, even as you yourself are being heard. Empathy is created by effective communication. And effective communication is something poetry can do better than any other type of writing. But you have to know how. You have to know how to communicate effectively using poetry. for poetry, by its non-conformist nature, by the fact that it draws up its own rules and makes up its own meaning, can very easily be obscure and difficult to make sense of. This is, in fact, the number one reason why most people do not read poetry for leisure. It is an irony that everybody likes poetry. Everybody thinks that poetry is cool, but very few people actually read it. Poetry is a genre of literature that has the most glamorous reputation, but the smallest market share. When people say people don't read, generally this is true. But when it comes to poetry, it's double whammy. People don't read generally, or people don't even read. When they come to reading, the last thing they would read is poetry. And yet poetry has such a magnificent and glorious and, glamorized reputation. So why don't people read it? It is because of this fact. The fact that the freedom with which poetry is created allows it, yes, to produce some of the most unexpected and beautiful forms of expression. But for this same reason, for this same freedom with which it is created, it often results in poets producing very routinely the most subjective, random, incoherent, obscure, and inaccessible forms of expression, things that nobody can understand what you're saying. To evoke empathy in a world that desperately needs it, poetry must communicate effectively. And to communicate effectively, the poet must first and foremost give up some of his or her freedom to write solely in accordance to the dictates of his whims or her whims, feelings, and caprices. You must give up some of that freedom. To communicate effectively, the poet must first and foremost condescend to write in accordance with a set of rules. And we're going to be looking at some of those rules of effective communication in poetry. Okay, so we're going to be running through a set of rules. There are rules of thumb. There are things that some of them I was taught, some of them have come out of practice as a poet myself. Effective communication has two aims: clarity and power. That people understand and people are hit by what you're saying. So they get it, and it also touches them, not just at an intellectual level, but strikes them deeply. All right? So I try to summarize them there: clarity and power, the principles of effective communication. And we'll go through those principles one by one. And where I remember to, I might come back and refer to some of the work that was sent in for this workshop. Number one on the list, clarity. I said, do not use strange words. So let me put it again. Do not use a difficult or a strange word where you can use a figurative expression. Writers can have a tendency to be carried away with themselves and their broad knowledge of vocabulary and the dictionary. When the focus is on communicating effectively, as a rule of thumb, do not use a difficult word where you can use a figurative expression. What does it mean? When it comes to clarity, contrary to the general rule in writing, shorter is not always better. So for instance, instead of saying somebody is grandiloquent, that means that the person uses highfalutin words, or big grammar or whatever, or talks in this very lofty, elitist, way, like Victorian, just uses words that is like I'm better than you, So instead of using the word grandiloquent, if you're trying to say that, you can say he talks like he doesn't use a toilet like everyone else. That's a figurative expression that conveys the sense of what grandiloquent means. It says it in a rough, earthy, grimy, gritty way that a layperson immediately understands, and it's a figurative expression, so it is poetic. And it is a rule of thumb I use in all my poetry. If you read the things that I write, you will hardly, I don't use words that people need to go check a dictionary for. And every time I want to say something and I wonder, will people understand the word? I ask myself, what does that word mean? And then I coin a figurative expression. I don't find a simpler word for it. That's not what I'm asking you to do. I didn't say replace difficult words with simpler words. No. I said replace difficult words with figurative expressions that convey the meaning of the word. All right. So it's like you are explaining the word, but you're not explaining the word. Okay. So that's a rule of thumb. So if you have a difficult word, some of these fancy words, like that guy, that's Edo lawmaker that's always confusing everybody. Which is that one that says like krinkum, krankum, and I don't even know what the guy talks about. I don't understand what he's saying. But that kind of person, if you're writing poetry and you're somebody that has big words in your arsenal, learn to replace them with figurative expression. All right. So that's number one. Number two says, when you cannot avoid the use of a difficult or strange word, explain it in context. So if you must use a difficult word, explain it in context. Explain it in context doesn't mean putting a bracket and saying, for instance, he is grandiloquent. Bracket, that means he speaks in high, elitist language. No. Explaining in context means that let there be something in the surroundings of that word that can help the reader guess what the word means without having to resort to an external aid, such as a dictionary or a person. So let there be something in the narrative that gives a reader some sense of what that word means. Here, let me use the example of, I think this is Aisha's poem. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, this is Aisha's poem. It says, I don't speak Hausa, so I don't know if I mispronounce, forgive me. It says Aljanu, verse 1. In Hausa, again, I don't speak Hausa, I don't understand all the Hausa in the poem. I don't know what it says. So to me, they are strange words. In Hausa, we say Rua, please don't laugh at me, I don't speak the language. Rua, Basu, Yami, Banzafa. It has to be filled with the blood of the innocent, stirred till it is a murky brown. Now, I assume as a reader that the words that come after the expression in Hausa provide some context to whatever has been said in Hausa is, which is what I mean by explaining something in context. You may not be directly translating the phrase, but you are saying something that allows me to guess at what I didn't understand means. All right, so it's an example of explaining in context. There's some, I didn't put it here, the use of simile. There's a point, where is simile? Okay, we'll come to it. Okay, so that's just an example I wanted to use. I wanted to use some of the stuff you guys sent in to show sometimes when you yourself have obeyed the rule, and also to show areas where sometimes in your writing you have diverged from the rule. We'll come back to this verse of Aisha's to see something else she did in there that she could have done differently. So here she speaks Hausa to non-Hausa speakers. They are strange words, we don't know what she's saying, but then the words that follow allow me to get by, allow me to read this poem without asking any Hausa person, what does that phrase mean? Which is what explaining in context means. So when you use a difficult or strange word, put it in a context, put it in a way, let there be words before or after that can allow me to guess what that word means, okay? So that's number 2. So do not use when you use a strange word, explain it in context. Please, any questions, any interventions, just drop it in the chat. So I can, even though my screen is shared now, I can't really see chats. But I mean, feel free to button at any time. So number 1, as a rule of thumb, don't use strange words. Use figurative expressions instead. And I've explained what that means. Number 2, if you use strange words, explain them in context. Don't just drop it there. Sometimes I see writers and they say things like, well, I don't care. You know, I'll just, I mean, and remember that this is rules of effective communication. Not all writing, if you don't care, if you're writing to purge yourself, all these rules may not apply to you. This is when you're writing because you want to communicate. You want the person to understand something tangible from what you're writing. This is what these rules apply to. So if you use a strange word, if you must use a strange word, explain it in context. Number 3 says do not use strange imagery. Strange imagery is different from strange words. Strange imagery is, it comes down to what a figure of speech is. What is imagery? When you say you're using imagery, imagery is a way of borrowing the attributes of an object or a person to attach it to another object or person. That's what imagery does. So if you say you are a lion, Dike is a lion, what the reader does is that the reader goes to lion and takes some qualities from lion and then comes and attaches it to Dike. So imagery would link to objects in that way. So one object is borrowing qualities from another object via the figure of speech or the imagery used. So for an imagery to work, if you use imagery in your writing, for it to work, the reader must know 2 things. The reader must know the object that you are asking him or her to go and borrow something from. And the reader must also know what quality in particular, what feature of that object do you want them to appropriate? I hope that makes sense. So if I say Dike is a lion, for that thing to make sense, you have to know what a lion is. Okay? So you have to know what a lion is. Then you have to have an idea, what quality of a lion am I supposed to attribute to Dike? Is it the lion's strength? Is it the lion's courage? Is it the lion's bearded face? Is it the lion's height? You know, so for imagery to work, the reader has to be clear about where they are going to borrow an attribute from and what attribute the writer is asking them to borrow from that source. So when I say do not use strange imagery, do not use imagery where the object that you're asking the reader to go and borrow from is strange to them. So for instance, if you are writing to a Nigerian audience, a lay Nigerian audience that is semi-educated, or for instance, and then you happen to be a fan of ancient Japanese culture, and you say Dike is a kamikaze or something. Dike is a kamikaze. Now, okay, you know kamikaze, the suicide pilot, so Dike is a kamikaze. So, and you say that to a Nigerian who has no idea what kamikaze is, because it comes from a strange culture. They don't have that imagery. They don't have it. You want the reader to go to the kamikaze pilot and borrow their courage, their suicidal courage, and attach it to Dike. Dike is kamikaze. But the guy doesn't even know what kamikaze is. Talk to us about knowing what features or attributes to borrow from. So the imagery just goes over their head because they don't know, they don't have the cultural context. So do not use imagery that is strange to that cultural environment. They can't borrow from it. It's like when we're in school and they would say as white as snow, which was a terrible way of teaching people because we didn't have snow. You know, I didn't see snow till I was an adult. So as white as snow was meaningless. It was useless. It was, you know, if you said as white as even a Akamu or pap or, you know, something that you see every day, then it hits the person. You know, that thing really pops. So as a rule of thumb, do not use imagery that is strange or alien to the culture of the target audience. Mine the local culture for your imagery, all right? Mind the local culture for your imagery. So that's number 3. Number 4, when you cannot avoid the use of imagery that is alien or strange to the culture of the target audience, explain it in context. All right? Explain it in context. This is very similar to what I said about using strange words, but this time it applies to imagery. So I gave you the example of saying Dike is kamikaze. If you say Dike is kamikaze to, you know, somebody who knows nothing about Japanese culture, or let me use an example. If I say Dike is a quantum particle. If I say to you now, if I write Dike is a quantum particle, I'm sure that to many of you listening, that statement is completely meaningless. Like what's a quantum particle, you know? And up to a month ago, that statement will have been meaningless to me. But a month ago, I happened to be sitting down one evening and I watched a documentary on quantum physics. And I realized that quantum particles are particles that are smaller than atoms and that they behave in a very strange way, that they don't obey any of the laws of physics. So quantum particles move erratically. They can move through walls. They behave very erratically. So now when I say Dike is a quantum particle, what I mean is Dike is enigmatic. Dike doesn't follow any rules. Dike defines explanation. That kind of thing. That's what I'm trying to convey. But because I said Dike is a quantum particle, to people that don't know anything about quantum physics, the culture is strange. So I've taken a strange imagery, so it's meaningless. Now, if I feel that I really want to use that Dike is a quantum particle, then I need to provide some context so that somebody who doesn't know what quantum particle is can still read it and guess what quantum or what it is I'm trying to borrow from quantum particles. And the way I can do that is by using simile in situations like that. So rather than saying Dike is a quantum particle, I can say Dike is as enigmatic as a quantum particle. That allows my reader to get away with not knowing what a quantum particle, because at least now I know what quality you're trying to borrow from a quantum particle. Now, it is not as strong as if I knew what a quantum particle is and how erratically they behave. Then the imagery would have its full strength. But just by putting in that simile, like, at least the reader is able to just take the quality. Okay, it's enigmatic, it's mysterious. Or instead of saying Dike is kamikaze, I can say Dike is as bold or as courageous as a kamikaze pilot. So simile allows you to introduce strange imagery while retaining some meaning. That's one of the functions of simile. So if you feel that you want to borrow imagery from strange cultures that people may not be aware of, I think of using simile. If you don't want to use simile, then similar to using strange words, put it in a way that people can guess at what you're trying to say. So I can say Dike is kamikaze. And the next line may be he faces danger without looking backwards. That can be the next line or whatever. Or Dike is a quantum particle. He moves, he moves through walls. He cannot be defined. So the next line gives context so that you can read Dike as kamikaze, and not knowing what kamikaze is from the surrounding environment, you have an idea what the word says. So once again, explain in context. So either you use a simile or you explain in context, okay? I hope everyone is following so far. So 1, do not use strange words. If you do, explain in context. That's 2. 3, do not use strange imagery. If you do, explain in context. All right? Number 5, I said, when you use imagery, leave sufficient clues as to which specific quality or qualities of that imagery you intend to appropriate. I've already explained to you how imagery works. Imagery sends the mind of the reader on errand. It means it says, go over there, take that quality from that object, thing, person A, and attach it to person B. So your mind the mind of the reader has to make that journey. And like I said, when you say Dike is a lion, and I go to lion, if I'm now we all know that because that expression is a cliche, because it's been used so many times. Everybody knows that if they say Dike is a lion, it's courage. So you go to a lion and you take courage. But if I say Dike is a kangaroo, all right, you know what a kangaroo is, but because the expression is not used so often, you're not quite sure what kangarooish feature you're trying to, is it that, does it mean Dike hops a lot? It doesn't mean he carries his children in a pouch. What about the kangaroo am I supposed to borrow from this imagery? All right. So this is a situation where you've shown me, I told you that poetry is about hints. So it's not a complete thought. You show people hints, but from that hint, the person needs to be able to guess the whole. But if the hint you give is not sufficient enough, then they are confused. They don't have enough information to guess the whole. Now let me give an example of this from even though he's not here, but let me use his work because it's one of the ones I looked at today. Oh, it's on my phone. Okay, so I can't use that one. I'll use other ones. The one that says walking submission. But anyway, you understand what the concept is, that when you are giving a hint, when you're using imagery, you have to be sensitive to the possibility of confusion as to what quality am I supposed to take from this imagery. So like I said, if you say this person is a kangaroo, because it's such strange expression, the reader may not, are you abusing the person or are you complimenting the person? I don't know, because I don't know what feature of a kangaroo you want me to borrow. So again, it's something you have to give more clues. Again, you can do that with simile. You can say Dike is dash as like something like a kangaroo. Then I now know what quality of a kangaroo. So Dike can sit still, he's a kangaroo. So I know, okay, you mean the hopping of a kangaroo. I can say, Dike's children are never far from him. He's a kangaroo. And okay, so I carry my children, they mean a lot to me. So these things can change meaning depending on what characteristic of that imagery you are referencing. All right, so the rule is leave sufficient hints so that the reader knows exactly what to go and pick from the referenced image, okay? Now, number 6, for clarity, I said, let there be an easily discernible flow. Let there be, this is one of the greatest, this is one of the most challenging things about reading poetry, the lack of a discernible flow. The lack of a discernible flow, where you cannot understand why this thing just came after this thing. Like you were just talking about toilets. Now you're talking about pistachio nuts or whatever. Like what is, like, how did we go from this to that? What's the connection? So when you're writing for clarity, for communicating effectively, let there be a flow that the reader can follow. You can use a logical flow like prose does, where you talk about this point, and you talk about that point, or you talk about that point. You can use a metrical flow, that's rhythm, where there is a beat. So this line is this long, the next line is this long. So the reader can see the reason why that your line is structured this way. You can use rhyme. So at the end, the words have to rhyme. It just gives something, a thread that the reader can just follow through your writing. You know, so let there be a flow. If it is not clear, we can talk more about how to construct flow. You know, but let there be a flow. Let there be a thread that the reader can follow through your writing. This helps with clarity. Okay. Now we're looking at examples of power, punch, putting punch into your writing. And I said, I didn't write it there, but the first thing I wrote in my notes here is, because after making this PowerPoint, I went back and read a lot more of your poetry, and I realized that, okay, I need to back up a bit. Number one, that should be on that list of power is cut out unnecessary words. This is a general rule of writing, cut out unnecessary words. If you write something down, and after writing it down, you take out some words, and that thing you wrote can still stand, then leave out those words. It means you don't need those words. This is even more true for poetry. I told you poetry does not have to be a complete sentence. In prose, you know that, yeah, you need a complete sentence. So there are some words that you have to have there, like there is a man, there is a man. There is has to be there to make it a complete sentence. In poetry, there is does not even need to be there for us to understand that man is there. Poetry deals with just flashes. We don't need the whole sentence, okay? So I said cut out unnecessary words. I'm going to point out some very common unnecessary words that people use that you should always watch out for. These ones are what I call introductions to things. For instance, in order to, that expression, in order to, because of the fact that, so that, or in fact, the word that, what are the words, that, they're just words that you use, that you're using to introduce something or to set something up or to connect to the next passage. Poetry doesn't really need those connections in many times. So personally as a writer, before I use the word that, even as a prose writer, I think about it, because that is pretty unnecessary. It's just a link between two ideas. And many times those two ideas can stand very well without that in between. So I call them introductory or setup words that don't really, they're just there to link two ideas because of the fact that, in order to, so that, as a result of the fact that, and some of them can be so long sometimes. And let me see if I can find, again, oh, I thought I had, oh yeah, I did it up here. Obey is not here. I think there was one, Umi is here. I'll come back to Umi's work. This is, cutting out unnecessary word. It was, who was I reading that served as a good example of this? Yeah. Okay, so can everybody see my screen? Can you guys see the screen?
It's sort of loading. I'm saying principles of, like, it's half.
Bring your shared window to the front. How do I do that? Okay, I'm coming. It seems the mistake is from me. Let me.
Yes, yes, Queen was just dancing now.
Okay. Can you see a poem on it now? Yes, it will.
It's bent. Maybe still.
I don't know why this one is refusing to share. It's showing me that there is a bit of a problem. I'm going to stop sharing for a while and just retry it. Let me try it again. Okay. Okay, can you see it now? Can everybody see it?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, okay, good. So I was talking about cutting out unnecessary words. So the first thing I noted there, I mean, the poem says you didn't come yesterday. It was the third, fourth, fifth time that you didn't show up. That is unnecessary. It doesn't add anything. It just connects. You didn't come yesterday. It was the third, fourth, fifth time you didn't show up. Is completely fine by itself. That is just an introductory, in this place, it just introduces this dependent clause. You didn't show up, or that clause, it just introduces, it connects to it. So you can get rid of it, all right? So things like that, it's very small, but then because of that line becomes very prosaic, what we call prosaic, reads like prose instead of like poetry, because of the attention you've put to making a complete sentence, which is not poetry is not interested in making complete sentences. It's just interested in communicating. You get the idea. Poetry is like somebody painting in a hurry. You don't draw a complete line. You just make dashes and dots, but then when you step back, the person sees the picture, you know. So that's how poetry is. So introductory phrases like that, so that in order to, because of the fact that, please, as much as possible, leave them out. Another sort of category of unnecessary words are tautological expressions that are quite tautological. Sorry, my screen is going up and down, but it's because I'm trying to find examples from people's work. So that's why once I settle on one, I have something from Umi. Okay. So everybody can see now, right? So this is an example of some examples of tautological expression. So there I have deep within. That's a common one. Deep within is slightly tautological, you know. Deep within, they say the same thing. But looking up at the first stanza, these cars, they shine like the stars. We'll come back to repetition. Only if you could see through them, you would know the story behind them. I circled behind them. It is not literally tautological, right? But it is figuratively saying the same thing as you would know their story, because your story is always behind you, if you understand what I mean. Your story is how you got here. So your story is always behind you. So when you say you know the story behind them, it's like saying the same thing twice. So that was saying too much, over saying the same thing, which is the same idea of sort of tautological, saying the same thing twice. So you can leave out behind them and still achieve your purpose with a little bit of tweaking. So that's an example of editing, cutting out on, and the impact of cutting out unnecessary words is that it condenses it's like you increase when you use more words than normal, you dilute the writing. when you extract those unnecessary words, it's like extracting water, you know, so it becomes conch. It becomes, so it's like now drinking the pure stuff. So I wanted to use those as examples in terms of cutting out unnecessary words. So that's number one rule of power. Cut out unnecessary words, okay? Now, number two, again, I didn't write it there, but when I was reading through people's works, I noted that. I said, watch out for adjectives that dilute certainty or immediacy. Adjectives, a poem, more often than not, particularly for those of you that like to write lyrical poetry, a poem should be in the moment. It should be in the moment. So adjectives that what I call dilute the immediacy or the certainty of something happening. Like in a poem, if somebody feels they are going to die, let me give an example. If somebody has cancer and the doctor tells them that you are likely going to die in 4 weeks, today they feel they are going to die. There is no I'm likely going to die in 4 weeks. The feeling of fear is now immediate, present. You are dying every day till you die. So you don't express it as it is the doctor that will say you're likely going to be dead in 4 weeks. The moment you hear it, you are dead now, you feel it. So if you're writing a poem about how you feel, you don't use words like likely. I am likely going to die. I am feeling like I'm likely going to die. That's not what fear is. Fear is not, I feel like I may die. Fear is now, immediate, is a certainty. I'm going to die. I am going to die. That's the voice in your head. I am going to die. That's why you're afraid. So when you are writing it, you have to communicate that immediacy, that certainty, that urgency. And that's why you avoid adjectives that weaken it, like likely or potential, may, perhaps. I'm not saying don't use it. I'm just saying watch, be very careful when you use words like that, because they show, when you're using likely, potential, they show a reasoning mind, a mind that is reasoning and weighing the pros and cons. And when you're writing poetry that is conveying passion, there's no weighing of pros and cons. When somebody is in love or in danger or afraid, you don't weigh up pros and cons. So you have to convey that animal, that instinct, that immediacy. Okay, so there was a poem that struck me, that expression. I think it was Obehi. This one, yeah. Okay, so this one is called The Bridge. It's about somebody contemplating suicide. All right. So it says, the bridge calls out to me, but I do not respond. There is peace in my deep, she says on a loop, but I can't find sleep. I am potential food for her waters. So you see how I just circled the word potential. That word potential immediately weakens the experience of the suicidal thought. Potential is very, so it weakens it, and I immediately circled it. And I said, if you had just said, I am food for her waters, even the reader is immediately gripped with the sensation of being drawn to jump into the water. That's what is pulling. Look, anybody can casually consider suicide. Everybody can wake up and say, I feel like killing myself today, and not mean it. The person that is suicidal does not say, I feel like killing myself today. In that way, there is a weight to it. There is a reality to it that the word potential takes away. So those words, those adjectives that show weighing up of options should be used sparingly in poems that are expressing raw emotions and feelings, okay? So again, I just wrote, watch out for adjectives that dilute certainty or immediacy. For example, potential, likely. Now, number 3, what is now number 3, which is number 1 on that list? I said, never use adverbs of degree. An adverb of degree is like very, a bit, a little, to. There are words that you use to try and increase the intensity of something. He's running fast. He's running very fast. Very is trying to increase the intensity of running. He's hungry. He's hungry a little bit. He's a little bit hungry, or a little hungry, or a bit hungry. A little bit is tautology. He's a little hungry, he's a bit hungry. So you're trying to show intensity, reduce the intensity. They do not belong in a poem. Wherever you want to use an adverb of degree, use a figurative expression. You know, he's as hungry as a lion or whatever, but don't you tell me he's a little hungry or he's very hungry. As a rule of thumb, do not do that. And I didn't go through with it. I wasn't able to really go through that second poem of Amina's. But I found a lot of adverbs of proverbs in many of the poems I went through. So there, come a little bit closer. Little bit, like I said, is one of the tautological expressions. Either come a little closer or come a bit closer. But then, apart from being tautological, even if you said a little or a bit, it is an adverb of degree. You avoid it. The only reason why I can accept it in this poem is it's enclosed in it's direct speech. Direct speech is allowed because it is reporting how somebody actually talks. So I can even let a little bit closer slide because it is direct speech. Okay. But here it's not reported speech. Here it's not direct speech, it's the poem. Today she looks a bit more alluring. So that's a bit more is an adverb of degree. You know, you just leave it out. Today she looks alluring. You know, if you want to show greater intensity, coin a figurative expression. Don't use an adverb of degree. To take you back a bit to what I said first about cutting out unnecessary words. This is another example. The line that follows. Her gray is different from yesterday's. She has dyed her blue a different shade. You see, she has, completely unnecessary. That's prosaic because you're trying to make a complete sentence. You don't need to make a complete sentence in a poem. Her gray is different from yesterday's. Dyed her blue a different shade. Fine. That dyed her blue a different shade is fine. I know it's her that you're talking. You don't have to say she. I know who you're referring to already. You've already established who the subject of this whole thing is. All right. The line that follows, just one jump, just again is an adverb of degree. So things like that don't belong in poems. In terms of making words pack a punch and just removing these things that dilute the power of your words. So do not use adverbs of degree. This thing about adverbs of degree also works for prose. As a general rule, adverbs are very bad in writing. As a general rule, you know what an adverb is? A qualified. So he's running quickly. Quickly is an adverb. All those ones that end with ly, quickly, swiftly, handsomely, beautifully, all this, they are lazy ways of describing things. So they normally don't belong in creative works, particularly not in poems. Then adverbs of degree should be particularly avoided. Even, I just use an adverb now, particularly. If I were writing, I wouldn't use say particularly. So things like very too, a little, you avoid them. Instead, in their place, you use a figurative expression. So if he's running very fast, you want to create, then use imagery to create very fast instead of saying very fast. Okay. Next point, I said, do not use on that list, I have switch up your adjectives. Okay, but before we get to switching up your adjectives, let me say this. Do not use adjectives as stand-alone words. Adjective is a word that modifies a noun. They're very important in poetry and other creative forms of writing. So the house is red. Red is an adjective. The man is strong. So it describes, it gives a quality to a noun, which is, central to writing. But as a rule of thumb in a poem, don't use a standalone adjective. So don't say the house is red. It's better to say red house than to say the house is red. It's better to say strong man than to say the man is strong. So it's better to use the noun and the adjective next to each other than to leave the adjective by itself, because it becomes very prosaic. You now have that complete sentence form. So it's just a rule of thumb. That's something you watch out for, to not use adjectives standalone. If you're going to say the man is strong, rather than saying the man is strong, it's better to use a figurative expression, like the man is a lion, or the man is a Goliath, or something like that, rather than using just a standalone adjective to describe the man. Okay, so this again adds power to what you're saying, because the man is strong is a very lazy, normal, typical way of describing something. In poetry, you elevate the language. You avoid telling people, you want to show. So instead of telling you that he's strong, let me show you that he's strong by using a figurative expression. Okay. So the man, avoid using standalone adjectives. Then we get to the point of avoid switching up your adjectives. Now, what I mean by switching up your adjectives is this. I'm sure you've all heard this. Avoid cliches in your writing. Avoid cliches in your writing. A cliche is simply a normal pairing of an adjective and a noun. Most times, like if I say, let me use examples. Every time you come to these things, even though examples are everywhere, you just forget. Okay. Mouth-watering aroma. Mouth-watering aroma is a cliche because mouth-watering is the adjective you would normally use to qualify the noun aroma. Mouth-watering aroma. That's how you normally say it. It's a normal pairing of adjective and noun. Strong man, beautiful woman, fast car. These are regular. This is how such nouns are regularly described. This is the adjective that people normally use to describe this noun. So that's what a cliche is. So when I say switch up your adjectives, it actually means if normally aroma is described as mouth-watering, mouth-watering simply means something, exciting, anticipation. That's the idea, concept of anticipation. So find another word that evokes the idea of anticipation and use it with aroma. I don't know, maybe you can think of one. I don't even want to say seductive aroma. The brain is not functioning well now. But that's the idea. This here I circled ravenous belly. Belly, ravenous, they go together. So it's a cliche. Find something else that depicts hunger, but that is not normally associated with the human belly, and then link them up. I think some people did, and I circled, but let's see if I can. Here I had a couple of what I call cliches: bittersweet memories. That's a normal pairing. Memories are always bittersweet, so cliche. Dark secrets, cliche. Good fortune, cliche. So you want to change cliches. But somebody, so the example I can think of in terms of cliche, just trying to give an example is a lot of people use the cliche, like when they want to say you have a strong jaw, a jaw that doesn't, like a boxer has a strong jaw. You know, they'll say you have an iron jaw, which is a bit of a cliche because iron is strong, so they attach it to jaw. But if I want to switch up that cliche, I can think of something else that is strong. So concrete is strong as well. So I can say you have a concrete jaw. But then if I even want to go further, I can, you know that old Nokia, whatever, 9310 or whatever, is that Nokia that never used to, I don't know how many people remember the first, those old Nokia that never breaks.
Yeah.
All these ones I have to replace every year. If I say you have a jaw like Nokia, that's 90, whatever, it's the same concept of a strong jaw, but all of a sudden it's a fresh metaphor because I've taken something that is not normally an adjective that is not normally attached to this noun, and I've linked them. So that's what makes it fresh. So bittersweet, you have to find something else that conjures up the memory of, conjures up the concept of it is sweet and it is bitter at the same time. You know, like agbalumo, maybe. Agbalumo has that sharp, you know, memory like agbalumo. So, it has that sharp thing, but then you're still eating it. So bittersweet, without saying bittersweet. When you say dark secret, those two words always go together, dark secret, So if you say, maybe a secret you don't want to let out of the cupboard or something, another expression, good fortune goes together. So it's not by force. I'm flagging it. Sometimes you want to use a cliche. That's what you want to say. But I want you to understand why it is called a cliche. Now, these are usual pairings of words often used to describe, intelligent boy, ugly girl. These are usual pairings of words, Scarface, hard hats, all these things. So sometimes when you're writing and you come to those words, you ask yourself, what's the concept? What's hard hat trying to express? What's the concept? Is there another image that has that concept that I can borrow that concept from that image? The moment you bring in a fresh image, then the whole thing becomes fresh again. Okay, so avoid cliches. That will help to freshen up your work. Then I said use progression. Someone was asking me earlier, I think Debbie, she may not be here now. Yeah, Debbie's still here, asking me how to tell a long story with poetry. I see that sharing is paused, but I'm just showing the slides that you were looking at. I don't know why the sharing pauses sometimes. But use progression when you're using poetry. When you're writing poetry, learn to use progression. Progression means that the poetry should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So your poetry should not simply be you repeating the, sort of saying the same thing in different ways, which is okay. But when you want poetry that packs a punch, you want it to be poetry that progresses from, you start, there's a middle, and there is an end. Now, in terms of progression in writing, progression at the very minimum, always has two parts to it. At the very minimum, is a two-part movement from conflict to resolution. That is a story. Conflict, resolution. Tension, resolution. Evidence, conclusion. Question, solution. Or problem, solution, question, answer. That is progression. That is what every movie, every book, every story, when you boil it down to its bare bones, that's what it is. That movement. So you have a problem, this is a solution. Start with a question, end with the answer. Start with tension, move to resolution. That's it. So in your poetry, you should have movement. So you should have a poetry that starts somewhere and then ends somewhere, and it builds up in between. So when you're writing storytelling poetry, you should also have a plot. You know, you have scenes. So while a book might have 20 chapters, a storytelling poem may have 20 verses corresponding to chapters. So each verse is a scene. You paint it, then you move to the next scene, then you move to the next scene. If you're writing proselytizing poetry, you're making a case for your argument, for the point you're making. So you can start with an intro or dispense of the intro. Then each verse is an aspect of the case you're making. Maybe you provide evidence, provide evidence, provide evidence, provide evidence, or counterpoint, end with conclusion, right? So it progresses. You know, if you're just expressing your feelings, even that can be structured to have progression. You know, so you can start from utter confusion, you know, from the place where you had no idea what was going on. You were just experiencing things and things were hitting you. And then slowly how you came to some understanding or some grasp or some grip of your reality. So you start from complete confusion, you end with some grip on reality. But either way, you're progressing. So you're starting from the beginning and you're moving to an end. You're starting from conflict and you're moving to resolution. That's what progression means. You know, so learn to use progression in poetry. So when you're writing the next verse or the next line, you ask yourself, what is it adding to what came before? How is it helping to move forward what came before? Am I simply repeating or re-saying what I've already said in a different way? Or am I adding something more to what I'm building up? And you build up to a climax. So you don't start with the answer and then, well, you could, but either way, you build up to a climax. You build up to just like sometimes as a poet, you think like a comedian, you build up to your punchlines, you build up to the main thing you want to say, and you end the poem there. So the poem climbs and ends at the climax. You shouldn't have an anticlimax. You know, the poem ends and it starts and it ends at the climax. Now, I took this really nice poem that Umi wrote. It's very short. Yeah. So she said, every day my head points a gun to my heart, but doesn't pull the trigger. So much chaos in one body. Now that's the poem. Beautiful. I circled my head points to a gun in my heart because that's very fresh imagery. I thought it was very fresh. I said striking imagery because normally the gun is pointed to the head, but now the head is pointing the gun. So that's some of the interesting ways poets can turn language on its head. Even though I suggested that instead of saying my head points a gun to my heart, I said my head puts a gun to my heart. Because normally you put a gun to your head, now the head is putting a gun to the heart. You know, so that really turns that phrase on its head. But the point I was making about progression is every day my head points a gun at my heart, conflict, but doesn't pull the trigger, resolution. So that's a two-part movement there. Story is done, complete. So much chaos in one body, anticlimax. We don't need it. Doesn't really tell us anything. Doesn't add anything to the story. We already know your head is pointing a gun at your heart. Chaos in one body. So much chaos in one body now becomes anticlimactic, which is the comment I made there. So it wasn't necessary. So every day my head points a gun to my heart, but doesn't pull the trigger. You've told your story. You fulfill the two-part movement. Progression is done. Bye-bye. Poem is complete. Okay, so that's what progression is. You know, it's about moving from beginning to end and ending at the end, not feeling the need to have anything afterwards. What you've said is enough. Okay. And then the last point I would like to make for power is I said make it a multisensory experience. You can't see my slides again. It's so annoying. You can't see my slides. Anyway, I said make it a multi-sensory experience. Make your poem multisensory. Multisensory means that it engages multiple senses at the same time. This is really now trying to bring your poem close to an ideal poem. Always remember this, that the more senses are engaged during an experience, the more striking that experience is, the more memorable that experience is. So if you are watching as you are listening, and you are also feeling and smelling and tasting, that experience is encoded in different ways by your brain. Your brain is encoding it as a smell, encoding it as a taste, encoding it as hearing, encoding it as sight, encoding it as sensation. So that one piece of information is encoded. The brain has used different ways to encode it. So it will be deep in your memory. It will be deep in your memory. That's why lectures in school are so forgettable, because it's very one-dimensional. You're just listening. You're not watching anything. You're not hearing anything. You're just listening, you know. But if you're watching a show, like in the theater, your lecturer, if your lecturer is actually on stage there's a video playing, soundtracks are playing. His point is, because now more of your senses are being engaged in that experience, the knowledge is encoded even stronger in your brain. This is something one teaches a lot in performance poetry. One of the things we talk about in performance poetry, sort of multilateral communication, engaging more senses so that the reader or the listener is really drawn into the experience. Now, when you're writing a poem that is to be read, you can still engage multiple senses by utilizing all the different aspects of poetry. So if you utilize structure, that is why, as much as the tradition now is to write in free form, I still believe in stanzas and structure, because it gives the eye something to engage with visually. So now I'm engaging your eye. I'm giving it something pretty to look at. If I'm also using rhythm, again, free form, people don't rhyme anymore, but I believe in rhyming, because I'm also giving your ear something to do, to pick up a rhythm as you're reading. To that, you're adding your figurative expression, the striking forms of expression you're using. So you're enjoying it. It's almost like taste. It's like you're tasting these words, like, man, this. And then on top of that, there is now a coherent message. So logically, you're like following the message. So you have multiple senses being engaged in that poem. Visually, you're enjoying the structure. Your ears are enjoying the rhythm. The taste buds are enjoying the taste of the words. And this is metaphorically speaking. And your frontal brain is following the message. Everything is working together to deliver a multisensory experience to the reader. And so that reading packs a punch. So it's like you're stacking things on top of each other, all emphasizing one thing. So you are, that work really packs a punch. Now I looked at, just to show an example of how it can be done, even when you're not rhyming or things like that. No, I've already looked at this one. Aha. So, even when you don't want to rhyme or you don't want to follow structure, I talked at the beginning about repetition as a very powerful literary tool. Repetition, because repetition has rhythm. It's emphasizing meaning. It introduces some structure. And so it repetition has a way of engaging those multiple senses. So repetition is a tool that I encourage people to use in poetry. Okay, so Umi started her poem, these cars, beautiful. They shine like stars. Only if you could see through them, you would know their story. That's what I would say. I wouldn't say you would know the story behind it. I would just say you would know their story. Within these bittersweet memories lies a dark secret and a good fortune. She was depicted as glamorous, with holes and stitches. Yet none could see, that's the line she said, yet none could see how she was acting so guile. I put a cross there, and I'll tell you why. Down to earth, a description of her, a rotter, she thought of herself, only if the world could see how broken she is, and I put a cross there. That phrase, how broken she is, I feel should have been repeated where you had how she was acting so guile. So you have a repetition so that the whole line would then read, yet no one could see how broken she is. Down to earth, a description of her, a rotter, she thought of herself, only if the world could see how broken she is. That repetition adds rhythm to that section of the poem. It gives it structure because a line is repeated, and then it also emphasizes the point. The point is how broken she is. How broken, that's what the poem is about. Okay, so that repetitive thing can work in that place. This is another poem where I looked and I said, oh, I wish this person had used repetition. The poem is, yes, it will. It says, you didn't come yesterday. It was the third, fourth, fifth time. Instead of saying that you didn't show up, and I said it was the third, fourth, fifth time you didn't come. I waited and waited and waited. Instead of saying, and you never came, and I've said I waited and waited and waited, you didn't come. I guess I'm used to it now, sleeping in the complacency of your failure. Striking imagery, by the way. The sky has accepted you. The rain has accepted you. Even the very earth we breathe reeks of you. Even so, today will be different. Okay, the rest of the poem is irrelevant. So in those three places at the beginning, I'll have used you didn't come. I started with saying you didn't come yesterday. It was the third, fourth time you didn't come. I waited and waited, you didn't come. So that repetition gives rhythm, emphasizes meaning, gives structure. So it engages multiple senses rather than the way he said it, where each time he said it in a different way. So he didn't create that repetitive, that rhythm, that flow to it. Now, if we go down to that poem, the one I circled, even the very air we breathe, to illustrate some of the points I made earlier, even the very air, the very air is an adjective of precision. Like you're trying to say the exact, the particular, And again, it's something that one thinks twice before one uses. Words like the very this, the exact this, a lot of times they're unnecessary. So the very air is unnecessary because there is only one air that we breathe. It's not like there are different kinds of air that we breathe. So it's unnecessary to say the very air we breathe. And then to then have even the very air we breathe just makes it all quite unnecessary. So those are some of the examples of unnecessary words. Okay, but the point I was ending with was just repetition. How repetition can be so multi-sensory, how it can pull in so many senses by creating rhythm, by giving structure, and by emphasizing meaning. And that's why repetition can be a powerful tool if you know how and when to use it in poetry. So we've gone through some of these things. I was going through this poem before I had to come on and to take on the workshop. This last poem, Watching Space, which is Aisha's poem. So that's why I wasn't able to look at it. Here I've explained how Aisha did a good job of using strange words, but explaining them in context, so that one felt that one sort of got what the poem was talking about, even though you didn't understand the words. I showed how Umi used a very impressive imagery, but then I showed what anticlimax is, how progression means you end at the strongest point. Here I showed various examples of cliches, which simply means normal pairings of adjectives and nouns. And then I also showed how repetition could have been used to good effect, was used to good effect in the first line, but could have been used even to more effect in later lines. If I didn't speak on your work, in particular, please, I read everything, but when I really started going deep into each one, I ran out of time. So at this point, I want to ask if there are any questions, comments, anything anybody didn't quite get. Oh, Nokia 3310. Yeah, that's the one. So any comments, any questions? Okay. Everybody is on. Aisha, was it helpful? Let me take people one-on-one. Yeah, Vera, that's good. I would really like everybody, go back and look at your poem. Just look at it through the eyes of these rules and just see for yourself where you can tighten things, where you can make things clearer, where you can make things more striking. They were all good poems. It's just how do you take it up a notch? How do you make it even more striking, even more poignant? Okay. So we've spent, we're getting close to the 4-hour mark. Maybe in another 10, 15 minutes, we'll hit the 4-hour mark. So let me, Umi, what about you? Was that helpful for you? Did you want more comments on your poems? Who else is here? Hassan, Augusta, Debbie. So Vera, in an esoteric poem, like I said, this is not general rules for every kind of poetry. I'm not saying don't write esoteric poems. If that's the way you want to write it, write it. But if your intention is to make it accessible, the thing about esoteric poems is the abstract nature of the things that you're talking about. The abstract nature of sadness or depression. These are very abstract concepts. And when somebody is depressed, it's not like they're sitting down thinking to themselves, I'm depressed, I'm depressed. You're having images, you're having thoughts, you're having feelings. And when you're writing from the subconscious, those thoughts and feelings are not organized. So that's what you're trying to capture is not organized in itself. However, one way to improve clarity in an esoteric poem is through the intelligent use of imagery. I told you one of the purposes of imagery is linking things together. So if what I'm talking about is something nobody knows anything about, like for instance, if I want to tell you about quackers, you don't know anything about quackers. How do I even start describing quackers? Everyone now say that quackers are like chickens. Immediately you're like, okay, it's like a bird, it's some kind of animal. By the way, there's nothing like quacker, I just made up the word. But I'm just saying a mysterious thing that you want to immediately make familiar to your audience. That is what figures of speech exist. That's why they exist, to make the unfamiliar familiar. To make the unfamiliar familiar. So when you're talking about esoteric things, that concepts and abstract concepts like maybe depression or darkness within you, the best way to do it is to try and use a figure of speech that allows, that familiarizes it for people, you know, that familiarizes it for people. If I see a work, then I can more easily tell you how you can make it clearer. Once somebody approached me and said she wanted to write about depression. And I said, when you're writing about depression, write the thoughts that come to your head when you are in a depressed state. Rather than trying to talk about it, write about the concrete thoughts that come to your head. You know, write about the concrete pictures that flash through your mind in a depressed state. Write about the fatigue, the weariness within, you know. So it's just how you approach it that makes the difference. Aisha says, I noticed some poets using different structure of verses. Can you talk about this? The structuring of a verse is completely at your discretion as a poet, completely at your discretion. So for as many poems, there are as many structures. It all depends on you. That's why I said that flow in a poem is completely dependent on the poet. You can structure your lines to a count. If you do that, then all the lines will end in about this. So if you're counting, so between the count of 1 and the count of 8, this line must start and stop. So you have a poem that looks like that, like a column. You know, it may have some variation, but it will generally look like a column because it's following a count. You know, if you have a poem in which different lines follow different counts, you may have a poem that the first line is like this, the next line is like that, the next line is like this. You know, so it will have, but then each verse will have that same shape. It's also following a count. If you have a poem that is not following a count, then it will be quite random. One line can be like this, the next line can be like that, the next one will be there, the next, you know. It all depends on, it's up to you, you know, but the structure of a poem is, what I'm telling you, is how a poem looks visually is an important element that you may want to think about because it gives the eye something to do. Okay, people, before we shut down, which we will do in about 15 minutes, about 2:15 my time, literally about 15 minutes from now. Let me quickly talk to you guys about progression as a poet, poetry as a career, and progressing. So not just writing for fun, or writing to get things off your chest, or writing as a hobby. If you want to take writing seriously, you know, what can you do with it? Where can you go with it? How do you progress with it? You know, and Again, I'll share the slide for the final time, just to walk you through that last element, and then we'll call it a day. Okay. So this is my special graph or whatever. Now, generally speaking, there are a couple of stages that realistically a poet can progress through. The first one is the social network stage in your career as a poet. This is the stage where, as a poet, you are validated only within your own social network. So at this stage, the poet's work has not yet transcended his or her personal relationships. Those who read and appreciate the poet's works are those who know him or her personally. All right. Then you have the peer-reviewed stage. This is a stage where a poet's work is validated by other poets, validated by poetry platforms and circles. At this stage, the poet is read within poetry networks. Their works are essentially admired by other poets. So here, this poet typically enjoys some level of reputational success and prestige as a poet, but not commercial success. Then you have the ivory tower stage, or the ivory tower poets. This is a stage where a poet's work is validated by academic institutions and teachers in classrooms. At this stage, the poet is being read within the school environment. Their works are used to teach poetry in classrooms. And here, typically, the poet will enjoy substantial reputational or institutional success, but not necessarily commercial success. Then you have the marketplace stage. This is where a poet's work is validated in popular culture. At this stage, the poet has mass or populist appeal. He or she is read widely by a diverse audience, both within and outside poetry circles. So non-poetry lovers, non-poets, just ordinary people appreciating and reading the work. Consumers of the poet's work at this stage are willing to pay to purchase it for their personal use, not for academic purposes. At this stage, the poet enjoys commercial success, but not necessarily institutional or reputational success in the ivory tower. And the last stage is the crossover poet. This is a stage where the ivory tower poet crosses over to the marketplace, or the marketplace poet crosses over to the ivory tower. So here the poet enjoys validation from both the academia and the marketplace, enjoys both reputational and commercial success. This is the pinnacle of our careers as poets. And this is typically how you progress. All of us typically start out at the social network stage. All of us typically move on to the peer-reviewed stage. From there, our paths diverge a bit. Some people go to the marketplace, some people go to the ivory tower. And then the pinnacle is the crossover poet. If you're able to end up there, that's the pinnacle of one's career as a poet. So all of us start out with our poems being enjoyed only by friends and family, writing poems that need you around to interpret the poem or give context to the poem before people can really appreciate it, because they need to know you and where you're coming from before the poem can be enjoyed. That's the social network stage. Peer-reviewed stage is when other poets start noticing your work and reading your work and appreciating your work. So now you're sort of getting expert critique, and it boosts your self-esteem and confidence a bit. To progress from there, I put ivory tower first because that's the more regular path. So you try to get into the academia. The path less taken is the marketplace, where you try and take your poem out into society. And then if you succeed, you then begin to hope to cross over. Okay. Very quickly, strategies for progression. Now before we look at that, like I said, we all start out with social network. Essay, you haven't even started social networking because nobody has seen your poems yet.
My own social network.
So that's why I said it's important for you it's important. You have to come out of the closet, share your poems with friends and family. You know, it should be a relatively safe space. You know, begin from there and begin to share it. Otherwise, you're keeping a journal. You're not writing poetry. Poetry is public. So share it with friends and family. Get into the social network stage. For those that are already doing it, they've shared with friends, they've shared with family, you know, you're ready to do something more with your poetry. That's where you should be thinking about peer-reviewed stages. You find your poetry groups, join your poetry platforms, go for your open mics, you know, begin to reach out to people who you feel know a thing or two about poetry. Either they are poets or they are poetry enthusiasts. They read a lot of poetry, listen to a lot of poetry, are not related to you in any way, either as friends or as family. At the peer-reviewed stage, and that's what you should be transiting to if you've really saturated your social network with your poems. Try and move to more objective people. Now, if you have done that already, and you're trying to say, okay, I've done the poetry slams, I've done the open mics, I've done the poetry readings and all that, I want to move on. The most accessible path, next step forward for you is to try and get into the ivory tower. And our mates trying to get into the academia. Now, getting into the academia or into the ivory tower, like I call it, the typical gateway is publication. You have to be published. And by published, I mean traditionally published, which is very difficult, very, very difficult. It's difficult to be published in any literary genre. It is exceptionally difficult to be published as a poet, particularly as a first-time poet, with no track record. It is almost impossible to be traditionally published. You know, traditionally published means that the publisher pays to publish your book. You don't pay for it. So normally you build up to publication by developing a CV as a poet, a respectable CV as a poet. That means you start trying to get your works published in reputable literary magazines, online literary magazines, print magazines. You enter them, you send your poems to online magazines, to literary print magazines. You enter for reputable competitions. You begin to apply for grants and fellowships in different schools and things like that. You may even consider, you know, you go for writing courses. You may consider even a degree in creative writing, some kind of master's degree in creative writing, okay? Because these things help you to build up a CV that can eventually get you a publishing contract. And for the ivory tower, poets normally need to essentially write classical poetry, whatever classical poetry is interpreted to mean in the time. And for the times we live in, that is typically lyrical sort of poetry. So poetry that majors on its aesthetic value, you know, the things we've talked about, figurative expression, structure, flow, self-expression. That's the kind of poetry that is considered as classical today. So that's really the kind of poetry, and that's the kind of poetry that would make it easily when you're trying to progress into the ivory tower. Okay, that's just a broad overview, just to give you an idea. So we're not going in depth into it. If, however, I said win awards, so apply for go in for your competitions, send your poems to online magazines, journals, apply for grants and fellowships, go for writing courses, and try and get a publishing contract. If you can't get a book one, having your several poems published in several reputable journals will help you build up a formidable CV that would still serve you well. Now, if you decide the ivory tower is not for me, or I also want to, because it's a bit of either or at this stage. You can't do both really. The marketplace means, okay, you know what? Now I'm taking my poetry into society. Now you're trying to market your poetry to the society in general, not just to experts in poetry or the academic environment. So here, the first thing to know is that if you're facing the society, you have to write poetry that appeals to society. So now you're looking at less esoteric poetry. So storytelling poetry, proselytizing poetry. If you're writing lyrical poetry, it shouldn't be the esoteric, obscure, inaccessible forms of it, but ones that people can access, because now you are trying to appeal to people who are not poetry enthusiasts. So you have to take into consideration populist culture and what can move in the market. Typically, you're looking at self-publication. Like I said, it's very hard for a poet to get a traditional publishing contract right off the bat. But if you want to go into society by yourself, you can self-publish and move into the market. Typically, to succeed in the marketplace, you're going to need some kind of mixed media kind of thing. So it won't just be poetry. You have to mix it up. You have to switch it up. So maybe you combine it with other types of writing. So you can have a work where you have a bit of prose, you have a bit of poetry, you have a bit of, so you mix it up. It can be substantially poetry, but then you support it with other things that people are more familiar with. You can combine it with other art forms. So you can mix it with, like I do, mix it with theater. So you can have performance poetry, stage-based poetry. You can mix it with music. You can mix it with film. So now we're having poetry videos and things like that. Then mix it with art, visual art. So, and then for the marketplace, you really have to also think about exploiting the digital economy. So the internet-based economy. So you have Insta poetry, Twitter poetry, Facebook poetry, and using that technology to your advantage. And then finally, crossing over. So as an ivory tower poet, eventually you want to be accepted by the market. And as a marketplace poet, eventually you want to be accepted by academia. Now, as a rule of thumb, it is easier to cross over from a marketplace poet than from an ivory tower poet. This is because commercial success, substantial commercial success, tends to attract the interest and attention of academics and researchers. So a poet that succeeds in the marketplace tends to attract the interest and attention of the ivory tower. You know, people then want to research what you're doing, how you did it, write dissertations on it and things like that, which helps you cross over into the academic environment. But institutional success, as ivory tower success in academia, does not so easily attract attention from the marketplace. So you can be a poet that is highly regarded within the school system. Your poems are read in schools, and yet nobody knows about you in society. It doesn't attract attention as easily from a lay reader who will not go and start reading something that they're using to teach poetry in schools. But something that everybody is reading, poetry that everybody is reading and talking about, tends to attract the attention of the critics in the ivory tower, who then want to know So in that sense, poets that go out into the marketplace can create things that then become institutionalized in the academic environment. Okay, so these are stages of progression as a poet, and this is how you can move from one stage to the next. Now you're all young, budding, or maybe not so young, but you're all poets at various stages. You can locate yourself in that progression and decide for yourself how you want to move things along. But I just want to assure you or tell you that poetry has prospects. It has a lot of prospects. As someone that has seen those prospects, I have seen those prospects. And I started as, like I said, a lyrical poet who was writing the same way essay is writing now, just for myself, you know, just to get things off my chest. Didn't think poetry was anything career, didn't, just had no interest. I was just writing because I needed to breathe, you know. And from there, I transited to sort of, you know, saturated my social network with my poems. Everybody who knew me growing up knew that Dike wrote poetry. Friends, family, I would, you know, circulate my writing. So my social network was fully saturated. And then I began to look for objective platforms and attend poetry groups. And eventually I published my first poetry collection, ended up publishing 3 or 4 poetry collections. So at that point, I was trying to progress towards the ivory tower, you know, but then I just felt restricted, you know, like I said, you have to write classical poetry. It felt too restrictive for me. I didn't like the separation between what poets were writing and what people were reading and enjoying. And so I sort of faced the marketplace and said, okay, you know what, let me try a different approach. And that led me on an interesting journey. I started writing different kinds of poetry, presenting poetry in different forms. And I experienced a huge amount of success along that path that eventually began to attract attention from schools and people coming to research what I was doing, to write about what I was doing. You know, so it's poetry has prospects. And these are some of the reasons why it has prospects. Like I said, it has a massive reputation. Everybody likes, it's surprising, everybody likes poetry. The idea of poetry, even if they don't read it, they just like the idea of poetry. Poetry seems to say culture. It seems to say enlightenment, even spiritual enlightenment. It just has a very good brand, a very marketable brand, you know. Cuts across all ages. Parents want their children to be exposed to poetry. Adults, poetry reminds them of some idyllic youth or childhood or ideals. So adults want to be associated in some way with poetry. So it has a massive reputation. Poetry is also the most versatile of the literary arts. It's very easy to combine poetry with music, combine it with art, combine it with theater, combine it with anything. Prose writers use poetry, you know, so it's very versatile. You can combine it easily with different things. It's the quickest time to market of all the literary arts. You can sit down in 10 minutes, 15 minutes and write a complete poem. You can write a complete book or a complete, you know, it's very quick once you get going. I said it has the largest work reward ratio. One tiny poem, you know, one short poem can give you this amount of success as a literary figure. For instance, I did a poetry show 3 years ago now, which is really a collection of 20 poems. I've toured around the country with it. It's made money, it's brought, you know, so whenever I think about that, that's essentially a collection of 20 poems was able to tour the country for about two and a half years, you know, staged over 20 times on 20 different stages, seen by hundreds, maybe even thousands of people. So I know, you know, so largest work to reward ratio. So it has huge prospects, particularly now. Like I said, the world is really in need of empathy. There's a massive need for communication across fault lines, across the lines of tribe, tongue, race, religion, gender, sexuality, whatever. All those conflicts are increasing. So the need for talking across those lines is also increasing. And poetry is a very effective way of communicating across lines, because poetry speaks to the heart, not the mind. In the mind, people have all their defenses up and raised. It's hard to convince people. But when you know how to write poetry, particularly proselytizing poetry, and you really know how to get to the heart, you find that you're able to move. You as a poet can come and say something without controversy that nobody else can say. Anybody else that tries to say it, there would immediately be a controversy, but a poet can come and say it and everybody's listening and enjoying it and appreciating it. So the need for poetry, the need for empathy is high, is very high. And yet poetry, of all the literary arts, has the smallest market share. And that is because poets are not exploited, are not really exploiting the potential of poetry. They're not really exploiting, they're not really trying to use poetry to tell stories, to evoke empathy, to communicate. They're not really trying to use poetry with music and with theater and with dance and with art and with, so that they're not doing what poetry can do. Historically, poetry was the king of literary arts, historically, but now it's at the bottom of the barrel. But in the context of the times in which we live in, the need for empathy, the quickness, the speed at which things need to be produced these days, poetry is apt. It's a very apt tool. And if anybody really knows how to exploit it, I think there is a huge market for it. So just encouraging you all as poets to really think about the potential of poetry as more than just a way for keeping a journal or a way for purging yourself, but really as a tool for poking at society's heart and conscience effectively. And in that sense, it can also make you a lot of money. And with this, I can tell you that we have come to the end of all this. So thank you all so much for bearing with me.
So much.
And listening to all of this. I hope it's been helpful. It's always difficult for me to do a workshop on poetry. Like I said, I didn't develop attending workshops. So I don't know what people talk about in workshops. So every time people ask me to do a workshop, I don't know what to talk about. But today I put a lot of thought in it and really just tried to break down my own practical experience over many years of doing poetry in different ways, in different forms, in different contexts, and try to condense it, and give it to you in 4 hours. So I hope it helped in some way. Keep writing your poetry. Keep using it as a personal sort of way of cleansing yourself. And it's important, keep doing that. But I'll also urge you to really consider moving things forward, progressing, either towards the ivory tower or towards the marketplace, expanding the range of things you write. You just write lyrically, you also write proselytizing, write storytelling, tightening your writing, using all these rules we've talked about to make it clearer, to make it punchier, and it will deliver eventually for you in whatever space that you use it. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, come to the end. Any questions, remarks? Okay. Oh wow, I've seen all the remarks. Very helpful. Thank you. This was enlightening. Thank you. Augusta, you're not serious. I saw your message. I'm still hustling. Okay, people. if I don't have any comments, I guess we can call it a day. And please feel free to reach out to me afterwards if you think up a question later or whatever, you want to ask something. Just send me an email or something, and to the best of my ability, I will answer your question. So I will then say good afternoon and enjoy the rest of the festival. Thank you.
You too. Thanks, Dike. Bye.
I think I should, how do you end this thing? Such an illiterate when it comes to this Zoom thing. But I shall learn eventually. Okay, there it is. This is how to end the meeting.